Welcome, everyone. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, dim those lights, maybe put on some headphones if that helps you drift away. Tonight, we're going on a journey through something unusual, something that exists in that strange space between laughter and unease, between comfort and discomfort. We're diving deep into the scariest episodes of Family Guy, and we're going to let these stories carry us gently into sleep. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Family Guy? Scary? The show about the Griffin family and their talking dog, the show filled with cutaway gags and pop culture references, that show is supposed to help me fall asleep with horror content? But here's the thing. Family Guy, over its more than 2 decades on the air, has ventured into some genuinely dark territory. We're not just talking about the usual crude humor or controversial jokes. We're talking about episodes that explore murder mysteries where beloved characters die permanently, episodes about domestic violence that make viewers deeply uncomfortable, episodes where Stewie actually succeeds in killing Lois, episodes that delve into body horror that would make David Cronenberg nod approvingly, and episodes that touch on psychological breakdowns, suicide, and the darkest corners of the human experience. The beauty of using Family Guy's scariest episodes as sleep content lies in something counterintuitive. When we encounter horror in an animated format, especially one we're familiar with, it creates this interesting psychological buffer. The animation style, the familiar voices of Seth MacFarlane and Alex Borstein and Seth Green, the knowledge that this is all happening in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, all of these elements create a safe container for exploring darker themes. It's like experiencing a nightmare while knowing you're dreaming. You get all the visceral reactions, the tension, the unease, but there's always that underlying awareness that you're in familiar territory. The Griffin family's living room becomes a known quantity, a touchstone of normalcy, even when the content gets genuinely disturbing. Think about it this way. Traditional horror content designed to scare you, the kind you'd watch in a dark theater or stream late at night when you want to feel that adrenaline rush, that content is engineered to keep you awake. Jump scares punctuate the silence. Sudden loud noises jolt your nervous system. The pacing builds and releases tension in waves designed to keep you on edge. That's the opposite of what we want when we're trying to fall asleep. But Family Guy's approach to horror is different. Even in its scariest episodes, even when dealing with murder or abuse or body horror, there's a rhythm to the show that our brains recognize. The 22-minute episode structure, the familiar character voices, the occasional cutaway gag, even in darker episodes, all of these create a predictable framework. And predictability, even when the content within that framework is unsettling, can actually be soothing for sleep. The show's animation style also plays a crucial role here. Unlike photorealistic CGI or live-action horror that can create that uncanny valley effect, keeping your brain alert and analyzing whether something looks real, Family Guy's simple character designs and bright colors create an immediate visual shorthand. Your brain recognizes this as animation, as artifice, as something removed from reality. When we see Stewie shoot Lois and watch her fall overboard into the ocean, yes, it's graphic, yes, it's shocking, but the animation style prevents it from feeling as visceral as it would in live action. There's an automatic emotional distance that the medium provides. This distance is actually perfect for sleep content because it allows us to engage with dark themes and unsettling narratives without triggering the kind of fight or flight response that would keep us awake. So, what exactly makes a Family Guy episode scary? That's the question we need to answer before we dive into our 30 episodes tonight. It's not the same criteria we'd use for traditional horror. We're not looking for the most jump scares or the creepiest atmosphere, though some of these episodes certainly have those elements. Instead, we're looking at episodes that venture into genuinely dark psychological territory. Episodes that make viewers uncomfortable in ways that stick with them long after the credits roll. We're looking at episodes where the comedy takes a backseat to genuine drama or horror. We're looking at episodes that tackle real-world horrors like domestic abuse, episodes that explore existential dread and mortality, episodes that feature graphic violence that pushes the boundaries of what you'd expect from an animated sitcom on Fox. Some of these episodes are scary because they break the show's own rules. Family Guy has always played fast and loose with continuity. Characters can die horrifically in one scene and be fine in the next. The show's universe operates on cartoon logic where consequences rarely matter. But certain episodes, like And Then There Were Fewer, explicitly break that rule. When characters die in that episode, they stay dead. The show's creators confirmed it was canon. Muriel Goldman, Diane Simmons, Derek Wilcox. These characters who had appeared in multiple episodes over the years, they were gone permanently. That violation of the show's established rules creates a genuine sense of danger and unpredictability that makes the episode genuinely tense, and yes, scary. Other episodes are scary because they tackle subject matter that's uncomfortable regardless of format. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q deals with domestic violence in a way that attempts to be serious and dramatic rather than purely comedic. The episode shows Quagmire's sister Brenda in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend Jeff, and it doesn't play the abuse for laughs. Well, it tries not to, though the execution was controversial to say the least. The episode ends with Quagmire murdering Jeff to protect his sister, and while there's relief that the abuser is gone, there's also the deeply unsettling reality that they've solved the problem through murder and are covering it up. That's horror rooted in reality, the kind that doesn't go away when the episode ends. Then there are episodes that are scary because of pure body horror and grotesque imagery. Stewie is on Scent, where Stewie impregnates himself with Brian's DNA and gives birth to horrifically deformed human-dog hybrid puppies, ventures into territory that feels more suited to a horror anthology than a primetime animated comedy. The visuals of Stewie's pregnant body, the graphic birth scene, the disturbing designs of the puppies themselves, all of it creates visceral discomfort. This is Family Guy channeling David Cronenberg, exploring the horror of the body transforming in unnatural ways. The show also creates fear through psychological horror and isolation. Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode where the two characters are locked in a bank vault for an entire episode with no cutaways, no other characters, just the two of them dealing with increasingly desperate circumstances, creates tension through claustrophobia and vulnerability. When Brian discusses his suicidal thoughts with Stewie, when Stewie eats his own feces and forces Brian to consume it to survive, we're watching psychological boundaries break down. The episode is scary because it strips away all the show's usual safety nets and forces these characters and us into an uncomfortable intimacy with their darkest moments. What we're not looking for tonight are the episodes that are simply gross or offensive or controversial for controversy's sake. Family Guy has plenty of those. Episodes that push boundaries with their jokes about race or religion or sexuality. Episodes that feature vomit gags or extended Conway Twitty clips. Those aren't what we're after. We're specifically looking for episodes where there's genuine horror, genuine darkness, genuine exploration of themes that make us question our comfort level with what we're watching. The difference between shocking and scary is intent and execution. Shocking is designed to provoke an immediate reaction and move on. Scary lingers. Scary makes you think about what you've seen hours or days later. Scary changes how you see the characters or the show, or even yourself. This also differs from typical horror in its relationship to humor. Traditional horror might include comic relief, moments of levity to break tension before building it again. But it's usually clear when you're in a scary scene versus a funny scene. Family Guy blurs those lines. The show can have a genuinely disturbing scene of violence, immediately followed by a cutaway gag about something completely unrelated. This tonal whiplash can actually make the dark moments hit harder, because you're never quite sure when the show is going to pull back from the edge, or when it's going to push further. That uncertainty, that inability to predict whether the next moment will be a joke or something genuinely disturbing, creates its own kind of tension. Tonight, we're going to explore 30 episodes that represent the darkest, scariest, most unsettling content Family Guy has produced. We'll start with the murder mysteries, episodes like And Then There Were Fewer, where an Agatha Christie-style whodunit plays out with real stakes and permanent deaths. We'll explore Stewie's darkest moments, the times when the baby's murderous tendencies stopped being a running gag and became genuinely threatening, when he actually killed Lois and took over the world before the simulation reveal pulled us back from that abyss. We'll examine episodes that tackle real-world horrors like domestic violence and abuse. Episodes that make us uncomfortable because they're reflecting darkness we know exists in reality. We'll venture into holiday horror, discovering how Family Guy has twisted Christmas and Halloween into nightmares. We'll experience psychological horror through isolation and family dysfunction. We'll witness body horror and medical nightmares that make us squirm. We'll explore death and the supernatural through the show's various encounters with death himself and with the paranormal. We'll see twisted relationships and dark desires that push the boundaries of what family-friendly network television would typically allow. We'll examine alternative realities and twisted timelines that create existential dread. And we'll conclude with some of the most absurd yet horrifying concepts the show has explored. Each episode we discuss tonight will follow a pattern. We'll set the scene, giving you the context of when it aired and where it fits in the show's history. We'll walk through the plot, highlighting the moments that make it scary or disturbing or uncomfortable. We'll explore why the episode works as horror, what specific elements create that sense of unease or fear. We'll share some behind-the-scenes information, the context of how the episode was made, how it was received, what the creators have said about it. And then we'll gently transition to the next episode, maintaining that calm, flowing rhythm that will carry you towards sleep. The goal here isn't to keep you awake with shocking content. The goal is to create a comprehensive, detailed, immersive experience where you can let your mind wander through these dark corridors of Family Guy's history while your body relaxes into rest. The detail and depth we'll go into serves a specific purpose for sleep content. When you're listening to sparse, minimal content, your brain has to fill in gaps, and that mental activity can keep you awake. But when you're listening to rich, detailed, comprehensive content delivered in a calm, steady voice, your brain can simply receive information without having to work to process it. The words wash over you like waves, each episode blending into the next, creating a continuous stream of narrative that doesn't demand your full attention, but is there if you want to engage with it. Think of this as a guided tour through a museum of Family Guy's darkness. Each episode is like a painting in a gallery, and we're going to stop in front of each one, examining the brushstrokes, discussing the artist's intent, exploring what makes each piece unique and unsettling. You don't have to remember every detail. You don't have to analyze or critique. You can simply let the information flow, let the stories unfold, and allow yourself to drift away whenever you're ready. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Release the tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. We're about to begin our journey through 30 of the scariest Family Guy episodes ever created. Some will disturb you with their violence. Some will unsettle you with their realism. Some will simply make you deeply uncomfortable with the places they're willing to go. But all of them will be delivered to you in this calm, steady, sleep-friendly format that respects both the content and your need for rest. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. We create long-form, detailed explorations of movie and television lore designed specifically to help you fall asleep. Whether it's the darkest corners of Family Guy, comprehensive character analyses, or deep dives into film franchises, we're here to provide that perfect blend of interesting content and sleep-friendly delivery. Hit that subscribe button, give the video a like if it's working for you, and let's begin our journey into the scary side of Quahog. The lights are dim, the world outside is quiet, and we're ready to explore the darkness. Let's start with murder. Murder mysteries occupy a unique space in entertainment. They combine the puzzle-solving satisfaction of a good detective story with the dark thrill of confronting mortality in a controlled, fictional environment. When Family Guy decided to venture into this territory, they didn't just dabble with a quick cutaway gag or a brief parody. They went all in, creating full episodes that function as genuine murder mysteries while maintaining the show's irreverent spirit. But what makes these episodes truly scary isn't just the body count or the violence. It's the commitment to consequences, the willingness to break the show's usual rules about continuity and character permanence. Let's begin with the crown jewel of Family Guy's murder mystery episodes, an hour-long special that changed the show forever. September 26th, 2010. That's when Family Guy aired what many consider not just one of its scariest episodes, but one of its best episodes, period. And then there were fewer, served as the Season 9 premiere, and it marked several significant firsts for the show. This was the first Family Guy episode broadcast, in high definition and presented in widescreen 16:9 aspect ratio. The production values were noticeably elevated. The virtual camera swooped around environments with a cinematic quality rarely seen in television animation. The lighting was more dramatic, with shadows and highlights creating genuine atmosphere. Walter Murphy's score, which would earn an Emmy nomination, punctuated every plot development with orchestral tension. This wasn't just another Family Guy episode. This was an event. The episode opens with a prologue set during World War II, a soldier receiving a letter from his girlfriend. In typical murder mystery fashion, this seems like it might be a Dear John letter, but it's actually just expressing how much she misses him. It's a fake-out, setting the tone for an episode that will constantly subvert expectations. Then we jump to present-day Quahog, where Peter Griffin receives a mysterious invitation to a dinner party in his honor. He's excited and confused, as anyone would be when receiving an anonymous invite claiming to honor them. But as more characters appear at the designated mansion, a sprawling Gothic estate perched on cliffs overlooking violent ocean waves, it becomes clear that everyone received the same invitation. The entire recurring cast of Family Guy has been summoned to this remote island location, accessible only by a single bridge. The mansion itself deserves attention. The production team clearly drew inspiration from classic murder mystery locations. Those old dark houses from Agatha Christie novels and films like Clue. Multiple stories with countless rooms, shadowy corridors, dramatic staircases, hidden passages, and an overall sense of being cut off from the outside world. The mansion's maid, Consuela, greets the guests with her characteristic broken English, leading them to an elaborate dining room. The gathering includes not just the Griffin family, but also their neighbors and acquaintances. Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer, and his wife Bonnie. Glenn Quagmire, the sex-obsessed pilot with his new girlfriend Stephanie. Cleveland Brown, though this was during the period when he had his own spin-off show, so his appearance was notable. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, the local news anchors. Mort and Muriel Goldman from the pharmacy. Seamus, the sea captain with the wooden arms and peg leg. Derek Wilcox, married to Quagmire's ex-girlfriend Jillian. Even a talking cat professor voiced by Patrick Stewart makes an appearance. The host reveals himself to be James Woods, the actor who had appeared in several previous Family Guy episodes, always as an antagonist to Peter. Woods had stolen Peter's identity in one episode, opened a successful restaurant to compete with Peter in another, and generally made himself a nuisance. So when Woods announces that he's become a born-again Christian and has gathered everyone to make amends for his past wrongdoings, there's skepticism in the room. He introduces his girlfriend Priscilla, a sweet-seeming young woman who apparently inspired his religious conversion. Woods begins apologizing to various guests, acknowledging specific ways he'd wronged them. It's actually somewhat touching, watching this character attempt redemption. Then, the first murder happens. Woods and Priscilla excuse themselves to prepare dessert in the kitchen. The guests continue chatting, the mood somewhat lighter now that the initial awkwardness has passed. Stephanie, Quagmire's girlfriend, sits in Woods' empty chair at the head of the table. There's a brief moment where she adjusts her position, getting comfortable. Then a gunshot. Loud, shocking, completely unexpected. Stephanie's eyes go wide. Blood spreads across her chest. She slumps forward, dead. The room erupts in chaos. Screaming, panic, people jumping from their seats. The punchline, if you can call it that, is that everyone immediately suspects Woods, who obviously set up this elaborate trap to murder people. They rush outside to escape, but a conveniently placed tree has fallen across the only bridge off the island during a storm that's now raging. They're trapped. Returning to the mansion with no other choice, the guests attempt to call for help. No cell phone reception. The landline has been cut, and when they find Woods again, demanding explanations, he's as confused as they are. They decide to examine the scene of the crime, but when they return to the dining room, Stephanie's body has vanished. Only a blood stain remains. The lights go out briefly, just a few seconds of darkness, and when they come back on, Woods is standing near the table with a knife buried in his back. He staggers forward, blood bubbling from his mouth, and collapses dead. Now the panic reaches new heights because Woods can't be the killer if Woods is dead. The investigation begins in earnest. The guests split up to search the mansion, despite everyone knowing that splitting up in a murder mystery is always a terrible idea. They find a hidden room, a study filled with Woods' belongings, including a diary that details all the terrible things he'd done to each guest. This establishes that everyone had a motive to kill Woods. They also discover a mechanical gun setup, a rifle mounted on a timer that would fire at whoever sat in a specific chair. This explains Stephanie's death. She was killed by accident when she sat in Woods' seat, but it doesn't explain who set up the trap or who killed Woods himself. As the night progresses, more bodies pile up. Muriel Goldman, Mort's wife, disappears from the group. They find her body upstairs, stabbed to death. Priscilla, Woods' girlfriend, also vanishes. She's discovered stuffed into a ceiling vent, her neck broken. Derek Wilcox goes off alone, trying to find cell reception, and he's struck with a Golden Globe Award before being pushed from a balcony to his death. Each murder increases the paranoia. Tom Tucker becomes the prime suspect when the Golden Globe, used to kill Derek, is found hidden under his bed. The group chases him through the mansion, eventually cornering and restraining him until the police can arrive in the morning. But the real climax comes when Lois, always the most perceptive of the Griffin family, pieces together the truth. She's speaking with Diane Simmons, discussing how Diane will have to anchor the news alone now that Tom is going to prison. Lois notices that Diane has already packed a change of clothes suitable for a solo news broadcast. Why would she pack that unless she knew for certain that Tom wouldn't be broadcasting with her? The realization hits. Diane is the killer. Diane pulls a gun, forcing Lois away from the other guests, leading her to the edge of the cliff overlooking the ocean. Diane's monologue, delivered with bitter rage, reveals her motive. She'd been in a relationship with James Woods, deeply in love with him, but Woods dumped her when she turned 40, replacing her with younger women. Then, Tom Tucker did the same thing professionally, having her replaced as co-anchor with a younger reporter. Her entire life fell apart because of aging in an industry that values youth above all else. So she hatched an elaborate revenge plot. She paid Priscilla to seduce Woods and convince him to become religious and make amends. The dinner party was Diane's idea, presented through Priscilla. Diane planned to kill Woods and frame Tom Tucker, destroying both men who'd ruined her life. But when Stephanie accidentally sat in Woods' chair and triggered the gun trap meant for Woods, Diane had to adapt. She killed Woods with the knife. Then she had to kill Priscilla because Priscilla knew the truth. She killed Muriel because Muriel witnessed her moving Stephanie's body. She killed Derek because he caught her planting evidence in Tom's room. Diane prepares to shoot Lois, to eliminate this final witness to her confession. She's ranting about her suffering, about the unfairness of being discarded and forgotten. And then a gunshot rings out. But it's not Diane's gun. She's been shot from behind, from a window in the mansion. She stumbles backward, loses her balance, and falls off the cliff into the churning ocean below. The camera reveals the shooter, Stewie Griffin, with a sniper rifle, calmly stating that the only one who gets to kill Lois is him. It's a perfect character moment, maintaining Stewie's obsession with matricide even while saving his mother's life. The episode ends with the survivors boarding a boat to leave the island the next morning. Tom Tucker is released, cleared of all charges. The characters discuss the trauma of what they've experienced. And the show confirms, both within the episode and in subsequent interviews, that the deaths are permanent. Stephanie, James Woods, Muriel Goldman, Priscilla, Derek Wilcox, and Diane Simmons are all truly dead. This wasn't a dream sequence or a simulation or a what-if scenario. This was canon. Family Guy had genuinely killed off recurring characters. So why is this episode so scary? Multiple reasons work together to create genuine tension, and unease. First, the violation of the show's established rules. Family Guy had always operated on cartoon logic where death was temporary and consequences were non-existent. Characters could be violently killed in cutaway gags and be fine in the next scene. And then there were fewer, explicitly breaks that contract with the audience. These deaths matter. These deaths stick. That creates real stakes, real danger, and real unpredictability. Suddenly, the show could do anything. If they were willing to permanently kill Diane Simmons, a character who'd been the news anchor since the show's beginning, then no one was safe. Second, the isolation and claustrophobia. The mansion on the island, cut off from help, creates genuine tension. In a normal Family Guy episode, even if something terrible happens, you know help is just a scene transition away. Here, there's no escape. The characters are trapped with a killer, and the storm raging outside emphasizes their vulnerability. The cinematography reinforces this, with rain lashing the windows, wind howling, the mansion creaking. It feels dangerous in a way Family Guy rarely does. Third, the procedural mystery structure plays into our paranoia. As viewers, we're trying to solve the mystery along with the characters. Every character becomes a suspect. Every interaction could be significant. The episode rewards careful attention while also subverting expectations. The reveals about each character's motive for wanting Woods dead make everyone seem guilty. That uncertainty, that inability to trust anyone, creates psychological horror. Fourth, the deaths themselves are treated with unusual seriousness. Yes, there are jokes scattered throughout. This is still Family Guy. But when characters die, their deaths are presented as tragic losses. The survivors mourn. There's genuine emotion. Muriel Goldman's death particularly hits hard because she was such a minor character who never did anything wrong, just an innocent bystander killed to cover up the real conspiracy. That randomness, that sense that anyone could be next, regardless of their importance to the story, that's genuinely frightening. Behind the scenes, the episode originated from a simple text message Seth MacFarlane sent to showrunner Mark Henteman that just read "Murder Mystery." From that bare-bones concept, the writers built an hour-long event that would push the boundaries of what Family Guy could be. The episode was dedicated to MacFarlane's mother, Anne Perry MacFarlane, who had passed away from cancer just months before the episode aired. There's something poignant about an episode dealing with death and loss being dedicated to someone the creator had recently lost. The episode received overwhelmingly positive reviews, a rarity for later seasons of Family Guy, which often faced criticism for declining quality. Critics praised the commitment to the mystery format, the elevated production values, and the decision to make the deaths permanent. The ratings were exceptional, with over 9 million viewers tuning in, making it one of the highest-rated episodes in years. Emmy nominations followed, recognizing the score and the overall achievement. What's particularly interesting is how this episode influenced the show going forward. It proved that Family Guy could tell a cohesive, serialized story when it wanted to. It demonstrated that the audience would respond positively to episodes that took themselves more seriously and had actual stakes. And it opened the door for future episodes to explore darker territory. If they could permanently kill characters in a murder mystery, what else could they do? That question would be answered in many of the episodes we'll discuss tonight. Episodes that pushed boundaries and ventured into genuinely disturbing content. As we prepare to move to our next murder mystery episode, let the image of that mansion fade from your mind. The storm subsides. The bodies are taken away. The survivors return to their normal lives, forever changed by what they witnessed. Justice was served, but at a terrible cost. And somewhere in Quahog, other dark forces are stirring, ready to unleash new horrors. Let's see what happens when the supernatural comes to Spooner Street. Sometimes the scariest horror comes not from human evil, but from forces beyond our understanding. The supernatural, the paranormal, the things that go bump in the night. These terrors tap into primal fears, the worry that we're not in control, that there are powers in the universe that don't care about our laws or logic. Petergeist, which aired as the season 14 finale on May 15th, 2016, brings that cosmic horror to the Griffin household. And like all the best haunted house stories, it starts with a transgression, a violation of sacred ground that invites disaster. The episode's title is an obvious reference to Poltergeist, the 1982 horror film directed by Tobe Hooper and produced by Steven Spielberg. That film traumatized a generation of viewers with its story of a suburban family whose home is invaded by malevolent spirits. The imagery of young Carol Ann Heather O'Rourke sitting in front of a television filled with static, announcing "They're here," became iconic. The movie tapped into the anxiety of the American suburb, the idea that even in these spaces, designed for safety and normalcy, evil could intrude. Family Guy's version maintains that core concept while filtering it through the show's absurdist lens. Peter Griffin wants to build a home theater in his backyard. Not an unreasonable goal. He's envious of his neighbor's setup and decides he needs something even better to maintain his fragile ego and one-up the competition. So he starts digging in the yard to create space for this project. What he doesn't know, or more accurately, what he doesn't care about, when he does find out, is that his property sits on top of an old Native American burial ground. This is horror movie shorthand, the instant explanation for why a location is cursed. Burial grounds appear in everything from Pet Sematary to The Shining to countless lesser films. The logic is straightforward. Disturbing the dead brings their wrath upon the living. Disrespecting sacred spaces invites consequences. Peter unearths a skull during his excavation. A human skull, which should be concerning to anyone with basic moral instincts. But this is Peter Griffin we're talking about. A man whose intelligence operates at the level of a particularly dim child. Instead of stopping the project and contacting authorities, instead of showing any respect for what is clearly a grave site, Peter does what Peter does. He makes terrible decisions. He uses the skull as an athletic cup, wearing it in his underwear for protection during sports activities. He treats human remains as a joke, as a prop for his own amusement. And that desecration is what triggers everything that follows. The haunting begins subtly, as it often does. Strange noises in the night, objects moving on their own, the television flickering with static. Stewie becomes obsessed with the TV, sitting in front of it for hours, transfixed by the snow on the screen. This directly mirrors Carol Ann's behavior in Poltergeist, and the episode acknowledges the reference while making it work within Family Guy's context. Stewie's genius intellect is somehow being drawn to, or manipulated by, whatever is coming through that television. The TV becomes a gateway, a portal between our world and wherever these angry spirits reside. Then things escalate dramatically. Stewie is literally sucked into the television, pulled through the screen into some other dimension. The family watches in horror as their youngest member vanishes into static and electricity. Lois screams. Peter finally realizes that maybe using that skull as an athletic cup wasn't his best idea. They need help, so they call in a spiritual medium, a character clearly modeled after the eccentric psychic from Poltergeist, played by Zelda Rubinstein. The medium confirms what we already suspected. The house is experiencing a full-scale poltergeist manifestation caused by desecrated burial grounds. The paranormal activity intensifies throughout the episode. Objects fly through the air unprompted. Doors slam shut and won't open. The walls themselves seem to breathe and pulse with malevolent energy. At one point, the house literally tries to eat people, with the architecture transforming into something organic and predatory. This goes beyond typical haunting fare into pure supernatural chaos. The family is under siege in their own home, and their only hope of survival is retrieving Stewie from the other dimension and somehow making peace with the spirits they've angered. The rescue attempt involves Peter and Lois venturing into the spirit realm through the television portal. The other side is visualized as a nightmarish landscape of swirling colors and distorted reality, a place where the normal rules of physics and logic don't apply. They search desperately for Stewie while being pursued by angry spirits who see them as invaders in their realm. The sequence plays out with genuine tension, despite the animated format. The voice acting conveys real fear. The music swells ominously. The stakes feel authentic. Eventually, they locate Stewie, and drag him back through the portal into the real world. But the house is still under attack. The spirits aren't satisfied with just getting their attention. They want revenge for the desecration. The climax involves the Griffin family fleeing their own home as it tears itself apart from supernatural forces. Furniture explodes. The walls crack and crumble. The roof lifts off and spins in the air. It's apocalyptic destruction visited upon this suburban household because Peter couldn't be bothered to show basic respect for the dead. The episode resolves, as these things often do, with the family somehow making amends, or the spirits exhausting their rage. The house is restored, probably through cartoon logic more than any actual explanation. Life returns to normal, or what passes for normal in the Griffin household. But there's an understanding that they got away lucky this time. The supernatural forces could have destroyed them completely. They were at the mercy of powers far beyond their comprehension or control. So why does Petergeist work as scary Family Guy content? Several elements combine to create genuine horror atmosphere, despite the comedic framing. First, the episode commits to its poltergeist homage in a way that respects the source material. They're not just making quick references and moving on. They're recreating the structure and key moments of that film while adapting them to Family Guy's universe. Viewers familiar with Poltergeist will recognize beats and scenes, and that familiarity actually enhances the horror because we know how terrifying those moments were in the original context. Second, the supernatural threat is taken seriously within the episode. Yes, there are jokes. Peter's use of the skull as an athletic cup is played for dark comedy, but once the haunting begins, the show treats it as genuinely dangerous. Characters are frightened. They're in real peril. When Stewie is pulled into the TV, it's not played as a gag that will immediately reverse itself. He's trapped in another dimension and might die there. That seriousness, that commitment to the horror, even while maintaining the show's comedic identity, creates an effective balance. Third, the visual design of the haunting sequences deserves recognition. The animation team clearly elevated their work for this episode, creating genuinely creepy imagery. The spirits are rendered as threatening presences rather than cute cartoon ghosts. The spirit realm is appropriately nightmarish. The way the house transforms and attacks is visualized with creativity and attention to detail. When architecture becomes hostile, when the supposedly safe space of home turns predatory, it triggers deep-seated fears about security and shelter. Fourth, there's something primal about the burial ground concept that works regardless of how many times it's been used in horror fiction. The idea that disturbing the dead brings consequences speaks to universal beliefs about respect for those who came before us. Every culture has taboos around death and burial. Violating those taboos feels wrong on an instinctive level. Peter's casual disrespect for the skull he finds, his willingness to use human remains as a joke, that violation resonates as genuinely transgressive. We understand why the spirits are angry. Their rage feels justified, and that makes the horror they unleash feel like karmic justice rather than random malevolence. The episode also benefits from its position as a season finale. Season finales often try to go bigger, to create memorable events that will keep audiences engaged during the off-season. Petergeist absolutely fits that bill. It's a spectacle episode with elevated production values and a commitment to its concept that makes it stand out from typical Family Guy installments. The horror isn't just window dressing. It's the entire point of the episode. Behind the scenes, the production team clearly had fun with this one. Creating the various poltergeist effects and the spirit realm sequences required more complex animation than usual. Voice director work ensured that the cast sold the horror elements convincingly. Seth MacFarlane's performance as Peter had to balance the character's typical stupidity with genuine fear when confronted with supernatural forces. Alex Borstein as Lois needed to convey maternal terror over her missing child. Even Seth Green as Chris had moments of vulnerability as the family faced this threat together. The episode received generally positive reception from fans who appreciated the horror homage and the commitment to the premise. Critics noted that it worked better than many Family Guy episodes from this era because it had a clear structure and actual stakes. The format of parodying a specific film gave the writers a roadmap to follow, preventing the aimless meandering that plagued some later seasons. and the decision to play the horror relatively straight, without constant undercut jokes, allowed the episode to function as both comedy and genuine horror homage. What's particularly effective about Petergeist as sleep content is how it follows the haunted house narrative arc so faithfully. There's the transgression, the initial manifestations, the escalation of paranormal activity, the crisis point where the threat is at its worst, and the resolution. That structure is familiar and comforting, even when the specific content is frightening. Your brain recognizes the pattern, knows how these stories unfold, and can relax into the familiar rhythm even as unsettling things happen on screen. As we let this episode fade into memory, imagine the Griffin house settling back into normalcy. The spirits return to their rest, appeased or exhausted. The television displays only normal programming now, no static gateways to other dimensions. Stewie is back in his crib, probably plotting world domination, but at least doing so in the material world. Peter has hopefully learned his lesson about respecting burial grounds, though knowing Peter, that's unlikely. The skull is returned to the earth, properly interred. The backyard is just a backyard again, and the family tries to forget the terror they experienced, though some fears linger in shadows and unexpected noises. These murder mystery and supernatural horror episodes show us one side of Family Guy's darkness. But there's another character whose capacity for evil has been a running joke since the show's beginning. A character who, in certain episodes, transcends joke status and becomes genuinely threatening. Let's turn our attention now to Stewie Griffin and his darkest moments. Stewie Griffin is one of television's most fascinating contradictions. He's a baby, barely able to walk, still dependent on his mother for basic care. Yet he speaks with the refined accent of a British villain, possesses genius-level intelligence, builds impossible technologies in his nursery, and harbors an obsessive desire to murder his mother. For most of the show's run, this matricidal obsession functions as a running gag, a joke that never goes anywhere because the show's format won't allow it. Stewie threatens Lois, plots elaborate schemes, builds weapons that should by all rights be capable of killing her, but something always goes wrong, or he gets distracted, or the show simply resets and moves on. It's dark humor, sure, but it's safely contained within the show's cartoon logic, where consequences don't exist, and characters can't really die. But what happens when the show decides to actually follow through? What happens when Stewie finally succeeds in killing Lois? That's the territory we're exploring now, and it's genuinely disturbing, precisely because it breaks the implied contract that kept the joke safe. Season 6, Episode 4, November 4th, 2007. This date marks a turning point, not just in Family Guy's willingness to explore dark content, but in how the show treated Stewie's character. The episode, broadcast as the show's 100th episode milestone, came with significant fanfare and advance publicity. Seth MacFarlane himself hosted a special that aired before the episode, highlighting favorite moments from the show's first 99 episodes and hyping what was to come. The marketing suggested something major would happen, that a character would die, though specifics were kept vague. This created genuine anticipation and anxiety among fans. Who would it be? How permanent would it be? Family. Guy had killed characters before, but always temporarily or in non-canon scenarios. This felt different. The episode opens on Lois's birthday. The Griffin family gathers around the dinner table with mediocre gifts that demonstrate how little thought anyone put into celebrating her. Meg gives her something forgettable. Chris's gift is equally uninspired. Peter likely forgot entirely, until the last minute. Then Brian presents his gift. 2 tickets for a cruise. It's generous and thoughtful, and Lois's face lights up with genuine happiness. Brian clearly expects that he and Lois will take this trip together, a vacation where they can relax and enjoy each other's company as friends. But Lois, without even considering Brian's feelings, immediately announces that she and Peter will go on the cruise. Brian's disappointment is visible, but he swallows it and accepts the situation. Peter is excited, already imagining the buffets and shuffleboard tournaments. And Stewie, watching this exchange, realizes he's being left behind. They're taking a cruise and not bringing the baby. They're abandoning him. Now, we need to understand Stewie's psychology here. Throughout the show's run, his hatred of Lois has been presented as almost instinctual, something baked into his character from birth. He sees her as his oppressor, the one who controls his existence, who tells him what to do, who constrains his freedom. His desire to kill her has been framed as a quest for liberation, to free himself from maternal control. But this episode reveals something deeper and more disturbing. Stewie's violence stems from rejection and abandonment. When Lois doesn't take him on the cruise, when she chooses Peter over him, it triggers something primal. He's hurt. He's angry. And for the first time, that anger translates into genuine, focused, murderous intent. Brian confronts Stewie about his reaction, pointing out that Stewie has threatened to kill Lois countless times before, but never followed through. All his previous schemes failed or were abandoned. He's all talk, according to Brian. He doesn't have what it takes to actually murder his mother. And this accusation, this challenge to his credibility and capability, becomes the catalyst for everything that follows. Stewie is tired of being dismissed. He's tired of his threats being treated as empty bluster. He's going to prove Brian wrong. He's going to show everyone that he's serious, that he means what he says, that he can and will kill Lois Griffin. The cruise ship sequences with Peter and Lois establish their relationship dynamics. Peter is an embarrassment at every turn. He defecates on the poop deck, somehow not understanding that poop deck is a nautical term and not an invitation. He tells wildly inappropriate stories at the captain's table, including one about how he and Lois almost aborted Meg during her pregnancy. He's loud, obnoxious, and completely oblivious to how his behavior reflects on Lois. She's trying to enjoy this vacation, to have a romantic getaway with her husband, but Peter makes that impossible. They have a significant fight, one where Lois's frustration with Peter boils over. She storms off to be alone on the deck, to get some space and calm down and maybe salvage something from this trip. And that's when Stewie arrives. He's tracked them down, followed them to the cruise ship through methods the episode doesn't bother explaining because the how doesn't matter. What matters is that he's here. He's armed with a machine gun, and he's confronting his mother on the deck of this ship in the middle of the ocean. Lois is shocked to see him. How did he get here? What is he doing? Before she can process what's happening, Stewie levels the weapon at her. There's a moment of silence, of tension, where Lois might still think this is another one of Stewie's games, another threat that won't materialize. Then he opens fire. The violence is graphic for Family Guy's usual standards. The animation shows Lois's body jerking as bullets tear through her. Blood sprays. She stumbles backward toward the railing. Her eyes are wide with shock and pain and disbelief. Stewie continues firing, emptying the magazine into his mother's body. And then she falls. Over the railing, plunging down toward the dark ocean below. The camera follows her descent, showing her body hitting the water and sinking beneath the surface, disappearing into the depths. Stewie watches from above, his face a mixture of exhilaration and satisfaction. He's finally done it. He's killed Lois Griffin. The episode doesn't immediately reveal that this was staged or a dream or some kind of fake-out. Instead, it jumps forward 6 days. Lois is missing. The family has returned home without her. A search has been conducted, but found nothing. Joe Swanson, speaking as both friend and police officer, tells Peter that the search is being called off. Lois is presumed dead, lost at sea. Peter breaks down, releasing an anguished scream of grief. The children are devastated. Brian is heartbroken. Even Stewie, watching the family fall apart, seems to have mixed feelings about what he's accomplished. Then the episode jumps forward an entire year. A full year of life without Lois. The family has adapted in various ways, some healthy and some deeply unhealthy. Peter has started dating again, moving on from his wife's death with the emotional depth of a goldfish. Chris has been told that Lois is at a health spa, protected from the truth because the family doesn't think he can handle it. Meg, according to Stewie's observations, has really started to flourish in Lois's absence, no longer under her mother's shadow. Brian remains suspicious and sad, never quite accepting what happened. It's Brian who starts piecing together the truth. He finds a receipt in Stewie's room for a speedboat rental, dated the exact day Lois disappeared. He questions Stewie about it, trying to be casual, but clearly probing for information. And Stewie, drunk on his success and eager to gloat, lets something slip. He refers to how everyone was led to believe Lois's death was an accident. That phrasing reveals everything. Brian realizes with horror that Stewie actually did it. This wasn't a game or an accident. Stewie murdered Lois, and he's been getting away with it for a year. Brian vows to bring Stewie to justice, but before he can act, things get more complicated. Peter has been behaving suspiciously. At the Drunken Clam bar with his friends, he mentions that Lois's life insurance policy finally paid out. He notes, almost casually, that he took out that policy while they were on the cruise, right after secretly wishing she were dead during their fight. This casts immediate suspicion on Peter. His friends, including Joe the cop, suddenly see him as the obvious suspect. The evidence seems damning. The life insurance, the timing, the fact that he had motive after fighting with Lois. Stewie realizes he needs to destroy evidence. He has detailed drawings in his room, sketches depicting various methods of murdering Lois that he'd created over the years. He has the gun he used. These items could link him to the crime, so he throws them away, tossing them in the trash outside. But in a stroke of incredible luck for Stewie, and terrible luck for Peter, Joe and Peter's other friends search the trash immediately after Stewie disposes of these items. They find the drawings and the gun. They assume Peter created them. The circumstantial evidence piles up, and Peter is arrested for murdering his wife. The trial sequence is brutal in its own way. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's wealthy father, testifies against Peter with obvious relish. He's never liked Peter, has always seen him as unworthy of his daughter, and now he has the opportunity to destroy him legally. Carter even stages a reenactment of the murder by shooting an Asian prostitute and then robbing her, somehow believing this proves Peter's guilt. The prosecutor gets Peter to reveal details that make him look guilty, admissions about the insurance policy, and his secret anger toward Lois. Brian tries desperately to defend Peter, to keep Meg and Chris from believing their father murdered their mother, but the evidence seems overwhelming. Peter is found guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge prepares to sentence him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Peter's life is effectively over. The family is destroyed. Stewie has achieved the perfect crime, killing Lois and framing Peter for it without even intending to. But before the sentence is officially pronounced, the courtroom doors burst open. A figure enters, silhouetted against the light from outside. As they move forward, their identity becomes clear. It's Lois Griffin, alive. The courtroom erupts in chaos. The Griffins are overjoyed and confused. How is she alive? What happened? Lois explains everything, or at least her version of events. After Stewie shot her, she fell overboard into the ocean. She should have died, but she was rescued by a reverse merman, a creature with a fish head and human legs, which is played for absurdist comedy, but also raises questions about what exactly happened in that ocean. The trauma of being shot caused retrograde amnesia. She couldn't remember who she was or where she came from. She wandered the country aimlessly, eventually ending up working at a fat camp in North Carolina called Camp Put Down Ataforca, where her job involved preventing overweight children from eating each other. She met a young man who seemed nice initially, but turned out to be a white supremacist. He took her to a rally where, after she spoke out against their hatred, someone threw a bottle that struck her head. The impact restored her memory. She immediately returned to Quahog and came straight to the courthouse, having learned about Peter's trial. But the most important part of her testimony is identifying who actually tried to kill her. She points to Stewie, her infant son, and declares that he shot her with a machine gun and pushed her overboard. The courtroom is skeptical. A baby? Murdering his mother? It sounds insane. But Lois is adamant. She knows what happened. She remembers Stewie standing there with the gun. She remembers the bullets, the pain, the fall. And now, Stewie's secret is out. His greatest achievement has been exposed. The episode ends on a cliffhanger, with the words "to be continued" appearing on screen, accompanied by music that deliberately mimics the Star Trek, The Next Generation. Two-part episode cliffhanger from the best of both worlds. Why is this episode so scary and disturbing? Multiple elements combine to create genuine horror despite the animated comedy format. First, and most obviously, the episode depicts matricide in graphic detail. We watch Stewie murder his mother. The violence isn't cartoonish or abstract. Lois's body reacts realistically to being shot. She bleeds. She suffers. She falls into the ocean and disappears. For the bulk of the episode, we believe she's dead, and we've watched her child kill her. That violation of the parent-child bond, that perversion of the relationship that's supposed to be about love and protection, creates visceral discomfort. Second, the episode examines the aftermath of murder in ways that feel emotionally authentic. Peter's grief seems real. The family's devastation seems real. When Peter is on trial for his life, when he's facing the possibility of spending the rest of his existence in prison for a crime he didn't commit, the stakes feel genuine. The show commits to this darkness for an extended period, almost the entire episode, without undercutting it with constant jokes. There are comedic moments, certainly, but they don't deflate the tension. If anything, they make the dark moments hit harder through contrast. Third, there's something deeply unsettling about Stewie's motivation and psychology. He kills Lois because Brian challenged him, because he felt rejected when she went on the cruise without him, because he wanted to prove he could do it. These are petty, childish reasons for murder, which makes sense given that he's literally a child, but that pettiness somehow makes it worse. He destroyed his family, took a life, traumatized everyone, all to prove a point. There's a sociopathic quality to his satisfaction afterward, his gloating to Brian, his lack of real remorse. We're watching a character we've spent years with reveal himself as genuinely monstrous. Fourth, the framing of Peter creates a different kind of horror. An innocent man is convicted of murder based on circumstantial evidence and bad luck. His life is destroyed, not because he did anything wrong, but because events conspired against him. That's a real-world fear. The anxiety about being wrongly accused, about the justice system failing, about your life being ruined by forces outside your control. Peter's terror during the trial, his realization that he's actually going to prison for killing his wife even though he's innocent, that's nightmare fuel of a very different sort than Stewie's violence. Behind the scenes, this episode represented a significant creative gamble for Family Guy. This was their 100th episode milestone, a moment that should have been celebratory. Instead, they chose to create something genuinely dark and disturbing, to take their running gag about Stewie wanting to kill Lois and actually follow through with it. The episode was written by David Goodman, who had previously worked on Futurama and understood how to balance comedy with genuine emotional stakes. The direction by John Holmquist ensured that the violence and drama landed with appropriate weight. The voice acting deserves special recognition. Seth MacFarlane had to make Stewie's murder of Lois feel genuinely threatening rather than comedic. His performance walks a difficult line, maintaining Stewie's characteristic speech patterns and mannerisms while infusing real menace. Alex Borstein had to play Lois's shock and pain during the shooting, then her confusion during the amnesia, then her determination when exposing Stewie. Seth MacFarlane's performance as Peter required showing grief and fear that the character rarely displays. The entire cast elevated their work to meet the demands of this darker material. The episode's reception was mixed, but largely positive. Many fans appreciated the show's willingness to take risks and explore genuine darkness. Others felt uncomfortable with how far the show went, feeling that it crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed even in adult animation. The advanced marketing created high expectations, and the episode generally met them by delivering something genuinely shocking and consequential, or at least apparently consequential until the next episode would complicate things further. What makes this work as sleep-friendly content, counterintuitively, is the completeness of the narrative within the episode. Despite ending on a cliffhanger, the story has a clear arc. Stewie decides to kill Lois. He succeeds. He gets away with it for a year. Peter is blamed. Lois returns and reveals the truth. That progression, that sense of story, moving from point A to point B to point C, creates a rhythm that your brain can follow without requiring active engagement. The detail and complexity provide enough content that your mind doesn't have to fill in gaps or stay alert. You can let the story wash over you, experiencing the darkness from a safe distance, knowing that this is all fiction, and you're just listening to someone describe what happened in a cartoon from 2007. Now, having set up this monumental cliffhanger, having revealed that Stewie successfully murdered Lois and that she survived and returned to expose him, we need to explore what happens next. The second half of this two-part story takes everything established in the first episode and escalates it to apocalyptic levels. Because Stewie doesn't accept defeat. When his crime is exposed, when he's cornered, when his mother has returned to testify against him, he doesn't surrender or repent. Instead, he doubles down. He decides that if he's going to be exposed as a murderer anyway, he might as well achieve his ultimate goal: world domination. Let's see what happens when Stewie Griffin becomes the most powerful being on Earth. Season 6, Episode 5, November 11th, 2007. 1 week after the previous episode's cliffhanger, audiences tuned in, eager to see how the story would resolve. The episode opens not with the courtroom scene, but with a news recap. Ollie Williams delivering his characteristic, loud, laconic summary of recent events. Stewie killed Lois. She's alive. He's in trouble. It's comedic exposition that brings viewers up to speed while maintaining the show's style. Then we return to the scene we left. Lois testifying that Stewie tried to murder her. The baby's secret exposed to the world. Nobody wants to believe it. How can a baby commit murder? How can an infant even hold a gun, let alone execute a complex plan to travel to a cruise ship and assassinate his mother? But Lois is insistent. She knows what she experienced. The family returns home, trying to process this revelation, trying to understand how their youngest member could be capable of such evil. They find Stewie waiting for them, armed with a pistol. The presence of the gun proves Lois's claims. A normal baby couldn't have a gun. The moment the family sees that weapon, they know the truth. Stewie doesn't try to deny or explain. He simply takes control. He restrains the family, tying them to chairs in the living room, holding them hostage in their own home. The power dynamic has shifted completely. This baby, who should be helpless and dependent, now controls everyone. And to demonstrate just how serious he is, to show that he's willing to kill without hesitation, Stewie does something that genuinely shocked audiences at the time. He murders Cleveland Brown. Cleveland walks into the Griffin house casually, probably coming over to borrow something or hang out with Peter like he's done countless times before. He doesn't know what's happening inside. He walks straight into a hostage situation. And Stewie, without warning or hesitation, shoots him in the head. Cleveland falls dead on the Griffin living room floor. The family watches in horror. This isn't a plot against Lois specifically anymore. This isn't about matricide or rebellion against maternal authority. Stewie has revealed himself as a genuinely remorseless killer who will murder anyone who inconveniences him. Cleveland was his friend's friend, someone who'd been kind to him, completely innocent. None of that mattered. Stewie understands that Cleveland's disappearance, unlike Lois's, can't be explained away. Cleveland is black, and the episode makes explicit that people will notice and investigate the disappearance of a black man in ways they might not have pursued other cases. This is both dark social commentary and pragmatic threat assessment. Stewie knows he's on a clock now. He can't hide this crime. He can't pretend it didn't happen. So rather than trying to cover it up, he decides to embrace his destiny as a villain and finally achieve what he's always claimed he wanted: total power over the world. He forces Brian to drive him to CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Stewie has a plan to hack into the CIA's supercomputer and take control of the global power grid, essentially holding the entire world hostage. When they arrive at the building, Stewie and Brian pose as CIA agents to gain access. The disguise is flimsy, relying mostly on confidence and the element of surprise, but it works long enough for Stewie to reach the supercomputer room. This sequence includes a crossover cameo from American Dad, another Seth MacFarlane show, with Stan Smith and Avery Bullock appearing to try to stop Stewie. But they're helpless against his threat. Stewie doesn't need to fight them. He just needs to convince them he's willing to plunge the world into darkness if they interfere. And they believe him, because by this point, Stewie has demonstrated he'll do absolutely anything. With control of the power grid, Stewie makes his demands to the world's governments. Make him president of the world, or lose all electricity. No power means no hospitals, no refrigeration, no water treatment, no communication systems. Complete societal collapse within days. It's not an idle threat. Stewie proves he means business by causing selective blackouts. The governments capitulate. Stewie Griffin, infant genius, becomes the supreme leader of planet Earth. What follows is a montage of Stewie's rule. He enacts bizarre laws that reflect his particular obsessions and pet peeves. Anyone who uses certain grammatical constructions incorrectly, phrases like irregardless, or a whole nother, or all of the sudden, gets sent to work camps. It's dictatorial grammar enforcement, which should be funny, but becomes sinister given the context. He's literally imprisoning people for minor linguistic errors, exercising authoritarian control over the most minor aspects of human behavior. Disney is banned from making straight-to-video sequels, which was a real complaint fans had at the time, but becomes darker when it's enforced by an infant dictator with absolute power. Stewie's rule combines petty grievances with totalitarian control, showing how personal neuroses can become oppressive when granted unlimited power. Lois, meanwhile, has been preparing to fight back. She confronts Stewie in his seat of power, a dramatic showdown between mother and son. She's armed, ready to kill him if necessary to stop his reign of terror. But in a moment of weakness, she hesitates. Despite everything Stewie has done, despite the murder attempts and Cleveland's death and the world domination, Lois can't bring herself to kill her own baby. She looks at him and still sees her son, her child who she nursed and raised. She lowers her weapon. And Stewie, who has no such qualms, immediately gains the upper hand. Just as Stewie prepares to execute Lois, Peter bursts into the room. He's armed as well, and unlike Lois, Peter doesn't hesitate. He shoots Stewie in the chest, then in the head, killing him instantly. The infant dictator falls dead. The world is saved. But the cost is devastating. Peter and Lois stand over their son's corpse, holding each other, grieving despite everything. They've killed their own child. Yes, he was a monster. Yes, he murdered people and enslaved the world. But he was still their baby. The scene plays without jokes, without undercutting. Just two parents mourning their son who they were forced to kill. Then the words, "simulation over," appear on screen. Everything pulls back to reveal that this wasn't real. None of it happened. Stewie is sitting in a complex chair-like device in his room, a simulation machine he'd built to test scenarios. Brian enters with postcards from Peter and Lois, who are still on their cruise and having a wonderful time. Everything we just watched, both episodes spanning an hour of television, was Stewie running a simulation to see what would happen if he actually tried to kill Lois. The conclusion his simulation reached: it's not worth it. He's not ready for that yet. Eventually, perhaps, but not now. Brian is confused and a bit outraged. Did the audience just watch an hour-long story that didn't actually happen? Stewie defends the narrative choice, arguing that at least the simulation didn't end like The Sopranos finale, where it just cut to black mid-sentence. And then, in meta-humor that became controversial itself, the episode cuts to black in the middle of Stewie saying "sentence," never quite finishing the word. It's a deliberate callback to that Sopranos ending, which had aired just months earlier and frustrated many viewers with its ambiguity. The simulation reveal is divisive among fans to this day. Some felt cheated, feeling that the show had led them on for 2 episodes with dramatic consequences, only to erase everything with a "it was all a dream" twist. Others appreciated the creativity and the willingness to tell a dark story within the safe container of a simulation, allowing the show to explore territory it couldn't actually maintain in the regular canon. The reveal also comments on the nature of animated sitcoms themselves, where nothing really changes no matter what happens, where consequences are always temporary, where death is never permanent, unless the show decides it should be. Why are these 2 episodes together so disturbing and effective as horror? Several interconnected reasons create their impact. First, they allow us to see what Family Guy would look like if it actually followed through on its darkest implications. Stewie has always threatened to kill Lois. These episodes show us what happens when he does. The graphic violence, the emotional devastation, the cascade of consequences, all of it plays out in detail. We get to experience the nightmare scenario the show has always teased but never delivered. The simulation framing device allows this exploration while maintaining the show's status quo. But for the duration of these episodes, it feels real and consequential. Second, the escalation from personal vendetta to global domination showcases how unchecked power and lack of consequences can spiral. Stewie starts with a focused goal: kill Lois to prove himself to Brian. But once he's committed that murder, once he's crossed that line, there's no stopping point. He kills Cleveland casually. He takes over the world because he can. The character progression shows how evil, once unleashed, tends to expand rather than contract. Without moral constraints or external limitations, Stewie becomes a monster, not because he particularly wants to rule the world, but because ruling the world seems easier than facing consequences for murdering his mother. Third, the episodes explore the horror of family violence and betrayal in ways that resonate beyond their specific narrative. Parent-child relationships are supposed to be sacred, built on love and trust and protection. When a child murders a parent, or when a parent must kill their child, it represents a fundamental violation of natural order. The scenes of Lois being shot by her son, of Peter holding his dead baby's body after shooting him, these images disturb us because they pervert relationships we hold sacred. The show forces us to confront the absolute worst possible outcome of family dysfunction. Fourth, there's psychological complexity in Stewie's characterization throughout both episodes. He's not purely evil. He's hurt and rejected, desperate to prove himself, trying to establish his identity separate from parental control. These are universal childhood struggles, the same impulses that make toddlers assert independence and teenagers rebel against authority. Stewie takes these normal developmental stages to their absolute darkest extreme. We understand his motivations even while being horrified by his actions. That understanding, that unwilling empathy with a character committing atrocities, creates cognitive dissonance that enhances the horror. Behind the scenes, the two-part structure allowed the writers to tell a much more complex story than typical Family Guy episodes permit. Steve Callahan wrote the second part, having previously worked on various episodes throughout the series. The continuity between episodes, the way the second picks up immediately where the first ended, creates genuine serialized storytelling rare for Family Guy. The guest voice talent included Patrick Stewart as the Talking Cat Professor, Paula Abdul, Randy Jackson, and Simon Cowell voicing themselves during Stewie's American Idol audition cutaway, and Willem Dafoe making an appearance, though not voicing his own character. The musical score for both episodes deserves recognition. Ron Jones, who composed music for Star Trek: The Next Generation, wrote and recorded the cliffhanger music that appears at the end of the first episode, creating that authentic Star Trek feel. Walter Murphy's regular scoring maintained tension throughout, while allowing for comedic moments when appropriate. The animation team elevated their work to match the ambition of the storytelling, creating more cinematic compositions and lighting than standard episodes. The reception to these episodes was generally positive, with critics praising the ambition and execution, even while having mixed feelings about the simulation reveal. The episodes demonstrated that Family Guy could sustain drama and tension across multiple installments when given proper structure and commitment. They remain among the most discussed and analyzed episodes in the show's history, generating debate about narrative technique, the ethics of reset button storytelling, and how far animated comedy should go into genuinely dark territory. For sleep content purposes, these episodes work because they provide a complete narrative arc with sufficient complexity to maintain interest without requiring active problem-solving from the listener. The story moves forward with momentum and clear cause and effect relationships. Even knowing the simulation twist, the journey through these events creates an immersive experience. The detail in plot and character motivation gives your mind enough to process without demanding analytical engagement. You can drift in and out of attention, catching different parts of the story, and still understand what's happening. The darkness is contained within the narrative structure, scary but safely fictional, allowing you to experience the intensity while moving towards sleep. Now we've seen Stewie at his absolute worst, murdering his mother and enslaving the world, even if only within a simulation. But Stewie's capacity for disturbing content doesn't end with violence and domination. There's another episode that ventures into completely different territory of horror, one that explores body horror and grotesque transformation in ways that make these murder episodes seem almost tame by comparison. Let's talk about the time Stewie got pregnant. Season 13, Episode 12, February 8th, 2015. By this point in Family Guy's run, the show had already established that it would venture into bizarre and uncomfortable territory when it felt like it. But Stewie is on scent managed to shock even longtime viewers who thought they'd seen everything the show could offer. The title itself is a reference to an old I Love Lucy episode called Lucy is Unsettling from the 1950s when television censors wouldn't allow the word pregnant on air, so they used the French word enceinte instead. That episode dealt with Lucy's pregnancy in a wholesome, family-friendly way, appropriate for 1950s television. Family Guy's version takes the premise of pregnancy and warps it into something genuinely disturbing, a tale of body horror that would fit comfortably in a David Cronenberg film. The episode begins with Stewie noticing that his friendship with Brian is deteriorating. They're not spending as much time together. Brian seems distracted, more focused on his writing and his romantic pursuits than on their adventures. Stewie, who has abandonment issues stemming from his relationship with Lois, panics at the thought of losing Brian too. He decides they need something to bond them together permanently, something that will ensure Brian can never leave him. His solution is both logical from a twisted perspective and absolutely insane from any reasonable perspective. Stewie will artificially inseminate himself with Brian's DNA so they can raise a baby together. The mechanics of how Stewie accomplishes this self-impregnation are glossed over somewhat, though there are disturbing implications in what we do see. He obtains Brian's genetic material through methods the episode doesn't dwell on, but that are inherently uncomfortable to contemplate. He then uses his genius-level scientific knowledge to engineer his own pregnancy, combining his DNA with Brian's. The fact that Stewie is a human and Brian is a dog doesn't seem to concern him. He's so focused on the goal of creating a permanent bond with Brian that he doesn't consider the implications of creating human-dog hybrid offspring or the horror of what he's doing to his own body. The pregnancy progresses rapidly, as you'd expect in a compressed television narrative. Stewie's body changes in ways that are deliberately disturbing. His belly swells grotesquely, disproportionate to his infant frame. The animation doesn't shy away from showing every uncomfortable detail. We see Stewie waddling around, struggling with his transformed body, experiencing all the discomforts of pregnancy, in a body that was never designed for it. There are attempts at humor about pregnancy symptoms and the relationship dynamics between Stewie and Brian as expectant parents, but the fundamental wrongness of the situation undercuts any comedy. Brian's reaction evolves from confusion to horror to reluctant acceptance. At first, he doesn't believe Stewie is actually pregnant. It seems impossible. But as the physical evidence becomes undeniable, Brian has to confront the reality that Stewie has created life using both their DNA. The implications disturb him. What will these children be? What has Stewie done? But Brian also feels a strange sense of responsibility. If these are going to be his children in some sense, doesn't he have an obligation to help raise them? The birth sequence is where the episode fully commits to body horror. The animation shows Stewie's labor in graphic detail, not holding back on the visceral unpleasantness of birth even in a cartoon context. And then the puppies arrive. That's what they are. Puppies, but wrong. They're not cute dog-human hybrids. They're grotesque creatures that look like the result of genetic engineering gone catastrophically wrong. Their features are distorted, combining human and dog characteristics in ways that violate natural proportions. Some have too many eyes. Others have limbs that don't quite work properly. They're alive and arguably sentient, but they're also clearly mistakes, beings that shouldn't exist. Stewie and Brian's reaction to their offspring varies. Stewie, having achieved his goal of creating a bond with Brian, seems satisfied initially. Brian is horrified by what they've created. These creatures will never have normal lives. They'll never fit in anywhere. They're the products of a scientific experiment that shouldn't have been attempted. But they're also alive, and that makes them deserving of care despite the circumstances of their creation. The episode shows Stewie and Brian attempting to parent these hybrid creatures, feeding them, and trying to give them some quality of life. But the fundamental wrongness of the situation pervades every scene. The episode doesn't provide a clean resolution. The puppies exist, a permanent reminder of Stewie's attempt to manufacture a connection with Brian through the most disturbing means possible. There's no magical fix that undoes the pregnancy or makes the puppies disappear. They're a consequence that has to be lived with, a body horror scenario with lasting impact beyond the episode's runtime. The final scenes show Stewie and Brian exhausted from parenting these creatures, bound together by shared responsibility, but also by shared trauma of what they've created. Why is this episode so disturbing? It works on multiple levels of discomfort. First and most obviously, the body horror of pregnancy in a body not designed for it creates visceral unease. Watching Stewie's infant body distort and change, seeing him struggle with the physical reality of carrying children triggers instinctive revulsion. Pregnancy in a normal context involves profound bodily changes, but there's an understood biological purpose and natural progression. Stewie's pregnancy is unnatural in every sense, a violation of biology and reason. Second, the human-dog hybrids themselves are genuinely unsettling. The show's animation team clearly worked to make these creatures look wrong, to trigger that uncanny valley response where something is almost familiar, but distorted enough to be deeply disturbing. They're not played for cute factor. They're presented as mistakes, as beings that suffer simply by existing. That existential horror, the idea of creating life that's fundamentally damaged and suffering, touches on deep ethical anxieties about genetic engineering and playing God. Third, there's something deeply uncomfortable about Stewie's motivation and methodology. He violates himself and Brian to manufacture a relationship dynamic that Brian didn't consent to. The pregnancy happens because Stewie decides it should, without regard for anyone else's agency or the ethical implications. It's a violation disguised as love, an act of desperation that crosses every imaginable boundary. The fact that Stewie can't see anything wrong with what he's done, that he views this as a rational solution to his fear of abandonment, reveals psychological damage that's frightening in its own right. Fourth, the episode touches on real anxieties about reproduction, parenthood, and the creation of life. What if genetic engineering goes wrong? What if we create beings that suffer simply by existing? What responsibilities do creators have to their creations? These are questions that real-world science grapples with, especially as genetic modification technology becomes more advanced. The episode explores these themes through its characteristic absurdist lens, but the core anxieties are genuine and relatable. Behind the scenes, the episode required significant animation work to sell the body horror elements. The character designs for the hybrid puppies needed to be disturbing without being so grotesque that they couldn't air on television. Voice direction ensured that Seth MacFarlane's performance as Stewie captured both the character's satisfaction at achieving his goal and the underlying desperation driving his actions. Seth MacFarlane's performance as Brian needed to convey mounting horror as he realized what was happening and what it meant. The episode received mixed reactions, with some viewers appreciating the audacity of the premise and others finding it too gross and uncomfortable even by Family Guy standards. Critics noted the Cronenberg influence, with several reviews specifically mentioning body horror classics like The Fly and the Brood when discussing the episode's aesthetic. The willingness to commit fully to the disturbing premise rather than pulling back or undercutting it with constant jokes gave the episode impact, but also made it difficult for some viewers to watch. For sleep content, this episode's horror works differently than the murder mystery episodes or the Stewie kills Lois two-parter. Rather than tension and violence, it creates persistent unease through wrongness. The scenario is so fundamentally disturbing that your brain keeps circling back to how wrong everything is. But that wrongness is contained within a single episode, a self-contained story that doesn't require tracking complex plot threads or solving mysteries. You can engage with the surface narrative, the pregnancy and birth and parenting, without needing to analyze deeper meanings or predict what happens next. The horror is immediate and visceral, washing over you without demanding active processing. These 3 episodes showcase Stewie at his darkest, from actual murder to world domination to grotesque self-violation. They demonstrate the character's capacity for genuine evil and disturbing behavior when the show decides to push boundaries. But they also reveal Stewie's core vulnerabilities, his fear of abandonment, his desperate need for connection, his willingness to do absolutely anything to avoid being alone. That psychological complexity makes him more than just a villain. He's a deeply damaged character whose evil stems from profound emotional needs that were never properly addressed. Understanding that doesn't excuse his actions, but it does make them more unsettling, because we can see the human motivations behind inhuman deeds. As we let these images of Stewie's darkness fade, imagine him back in his crib, plotting and scheming, but contained within the safe boundaries of typical Family Guy episodes, where consequences don't stick, and horror is always temporary. The simulation ends. The hybrid puppies fade into the show's forgotten continuity. Lois is alive and well. The world was never actually enslaved by an infant dictator. These were glimpses into darkness, explorations of what could happen in a universe without the show's usual protective barriers. But now, we return to safer territory, though safer is relative when discussing Family Guy's scariest content. We've seen murder mysteries and supernatural hauntings, and Stewie's capacity for evil. Now we need to examine episodes that tackle a different kind of horror, one rooted in reality rather than fantasy. Sometimes the scariest content doesn't involve murders or monsters. Sometimes it involves recognizing patterns of abuse and violence that exist in the real world, seeing them reflected in animated form, and being forced to confront how uncomfortable those reflections make us. Let's talk about domestic horror and the darkest edges of human relationships. Horror rooted in reality carries a different weight than supernatural threats or cartoonish violence. When animated shows venture into depicting real-world trauma like domestic abuse, sexual harassment, or systemic violence, they're asking viewers to confront darkness that exists outside the television screen. Family Guy has attempted this several times throughout its run, with varying degrees of success and controversy. These episodes don't offer the escape of fantasy. They hold up mirrors to genuine suffering, and those reflections can be deeply uncomfortable, even when filtered through animation and attempted humor. The 2 episodes we're examining now represent Family Guy's most controversial attempts at addressing domestic violence, and they demonstrate both the potential and the pitfalls of using comedy animation to explore serious trauma. Season 10, Episode 3, October 30th, 2011. The episode aired on Halloween, though its content has nothing to do with traditional holiday horror. Instead, it tackles domestic abuse in a way that sparked immediate controversy and continues to generate debate years later. The episode's title, Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, announces its serious intent from the start. This isn't going to be a typical Family Guy romp. The Screams of Silence refers to abuse happening behind closed doors, violence that victims can't or won't report, suffering that goes unacknowledged by society. The episode opens with Quagmire recovering from what's euphemistically called an accident. He's in the hospital after nearly dying from autoerotic asphyxiation, which the show plays for uncomfortable humor before pivoting to the main plot. While Quagmire recovers, his sister Brenda visits along with her boyfriend Jeff. Immediately, the audience sees red flags in their relationship. Jeff is controlling, verbally abusive, dismissive of Brenda's feelings. He speaks to her with contempt, treats her like property rather than a partner. Brenda makes excuses for his behavior, minimizes the severity of his treatment, exhibits all the classic signs of someone trapped in an abusive relationship. The abuse isn't subtle or hidden from other characters, which became one of the episode's most criticized elements. Jeff openly insults and demeans Brenda in front of others. He's physically rough with her in public. When Lois tries to talk to Brenda about leaving Jeff, Brenda shows up with a black eye and still defends her abuser. The episode attempts to show how abuse victims rationalize their situations, how they make excuses and blame themselves, but the execution was heavy-handed. Real abuse often happens privately, with abusers presenting charming public facades while reserving their violence for behind closed doors. Jeff's blatant public abuse stretches credibility and simplifies the complex dynamics of these relationships. The family stages an intervention, gathering everyone to confront Brenda about Jeff's treatment. This sequence includes some of the episode's most controversial dialogue. Quagmire delivers an impassioned speech where he tells Brenda that by staying with Jeff, she's choosing to be a victim, that she's not acting like a woman, but like a cowardly punching bag. The speech is meant to be a tough love wake-up call, but it veers into victim-blaming territory. Domestic abuse survivors don't choose to be victims. They're trapped by fear, economic dependence, emotional manipulation, threats against themselves or loved ones, and numerous other factors. Reducing their situation to a simple choice ignores the reality of how abusive relationships function. The intervention fails. Brenda announces she's pregnant and staying with Jeff. The men, Peter, Joe, and Quagmire, decide that words won't work against someone like Jeff. They determine the only solution is to kill him. This vigilante justice plot takes over the episode's second half. They lure Jeff into the woods under the pretense of a hunting trip. But Jeff, who's not just abusive, but also heavily armed and paranoid, turns the tables on them. He knocks out Peter and Joe, then forces Quagmire deeper into the forest with the intention of murdering him. The confrontation between Quagmire and Jeff becomes a brutal fight. Jeff beats Quagmire viciously, then begins strangling him. Quagmire, in a moment that's both triumphant and disturbing, reveals that he strangles himself regularly during his sexual activities, so he has a high tolerance for oxygen deprivation. He survives long enough to get to a car and runs Jeff down, crushing him against a tree and killing him. The men return home and present Brenda with a forged letter claiming Jeff has left her. They never tell her they murdered her boyfriend. Brenda breaks down crying, devastated by his abandonment. The episode's fundamental problem is tonal inconsistency. It wants to treat domestic abuse as a serious issue worthy of dramatic weight, but it's also trying to be Family Guy, inserting cutaway gags and jokes throughout. There's a musical number called Iraq Lobster that has nothing to do with the plot. Peter makes inappropriate jokes during the intervention. The show can't decide whether it's a serious exploration of domestic violence or a dark comedy about killing an abuser, so it awkwardly tries to be both and succeeds at neither. The behind-the-scenes context reveals that the episode was controversial even during production. Writer Alex Sulkin, who penned the script, clearly intended to make a statement about domestic abuse and how society fails victims. Director Dominic Bianchi, who had directed many acclaimed episodes, including the bottle episode Brian and Stewie, brought dramatic weight to the abusive scenes. Guest voice actress Caitlin Olsen from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia voiced Brenda with genuine pain and confusion. The creative team was trying to do something meaningful, but the execution left viewers divided. The reception was overwhelmingly negative from critics and advocacy groups. Organizations working with domestic abuse survivors criticized the episode for victim blaming, for suggesting that murder is an appropriate response to abuse, for failing to show Brenda getting actual help or developing the psychological tools to recognize and escape abusive patterns. The episode shows the problem being solved by the abuser's death, but it doesn't address Brenda's underlying vulnerabilities or give her agency in her own rescue. She remains passive throughout, an object to be saved, rather than a person who escapes. Media coverage of the episode highlighted its failures to accurately depict domestic abuse dynamics. Real abuse victims rarely encounter partners who are openly violent in public. Real abusers often isolate their victims from family and friends, making intervention difficult. Real solutions involve resources like shelters, legal protection, therapy, and economic independence, not vigilante murder. The episode's simplified portrayal of abuse as something that's obvious to everyone and solved through violence does a disservice to real victims and the complex work required to help them. Some viewers did appreciate the episode's attempt to tackle a serious subject and the cathartic element of seeing the abuser face consequences. In a lot of real-world cases, abusers face minimal consequences or continue their patterns with new victims. The fantasy of final, decisive justice appeals to our desire for clear resolutions to messy problems. But that catharsis comes at the cost of accuracy and genuine understanding of the issue the episode claims to address. A director's cut of the episode was released years later that attempted to address some criticisms by making Jeff's abuse more subtle initially, showing him with a charming public persona that gradually reveals itself as sinister. This version improves the episode somewhat by better reflecting how real abusive relationships often develop, but it can't fix the fundamental problems with the episode's approach and message. Why is this episode scary? It's scary because it reflects real horror that people experience. Domestic violence kills. It destroys lives even when it doesn't end in death. The fear that someone who claims to love you will hurt you. The prison of a relationship where you're constantly walking on eggshells. The helplessness of watching someone you care about trapped in an abusive situation. These are genuine nightmares that countless people live through. Seeing them depicted, even poorly, in an animated comedy creates cognitive dissonance. The cartoon format says this should be safe and funny, but the content is neither. The episode is also scary because of what it reveals about societal attitudes toward abuse. The victim-blaming elements, the focus on the men who rescue Brenda rather than on Brenda's own journey, the suggestion that murder is an acceptable solution, all of these reflect real problematic attitudes that exist in society. The episode becomes a horror show, not just because of its depicted abuse, but because it demonstrates how even well-intentioned people can get these issues so wrong. For sleep content, this episode works through sheer uncomfortable intensity. The subject matter is heavy enough that your brain doesn't need to work to stay engaged. The emotional weight of the content washes over you, creating a persistent unease that doesn't require active processing. You can drift in and out of attention, catching different scenes, and still feel the episode's oppressive atmosphere. The darkness is complete and unrelenting, only briefly interrupted by misguided attempts at humor that themselves become part of the discomfort. Now, having examined Family Guy's most controversial attempt at addressing domestic abuse from a victim's perspective, we need to look at another episode that tackles abuse from a different angle. What happens when the show tries to play abuse for comedy, but with the genders reversed? What happens when Quagmire, a character defined by sexual aggression and predatory behavior, finds himself on the receiving end of violence and control? The result is equally uncomfortable, but for different reasons. Season 12, Episode 3, October 20th, 2013. Quagmire's Quagmire presents itself partially as a Halloween episode, with costumes and party scenes. But the main plot concerns Quagmire meeting a woman named Sonia, who shares his enthusiasm for deviant sexual behavior. At first, this seems perfect for Quagmire. Finally, a woman who matches his energy, who wants the same extreme experiences he craves. They hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared proclivities. But as the relationship develops, it becomes clear that Sonia's desires extend beyond consensual kink into genuine abuse and control. Quagmire starts showing up to work and social gatherings with black eyes and visible injuries. His friends express concern, but Quagmire initially makes excuses. He's clumsy. He walked into a door. Classic abuse victim deflections. But eventually, he admits the truth. Sonia is abusing him. She's violent, controlling, and he's trapped in the relationship because he's ashamed to admit he's being victimized by a woman. The episode attempts to address male victims of domestic abuse, a real issue that often goes unreported because of shame and societal expectations about masculinity. The problem is that the episode can't decide if it's taking this seriously or playing it for laughs. There are extended sequences of Sonia beating Quagmire that are clearly meant to be humorous because the reversal of typical gender dynamics is supposedly funny. When Quagmire admits he prefers to be in control sexually and relationally, it's framed as a joke about his usual dominant personality. The show seems to suggest that Quagmire is only uncomfortable with the abuse because it violates his preferred power dynamic, not because abuse is inherently wrong. The resolution involves Quagmire's friends helping him escape the relationship, but again, the episode treats this more as comedy than drama. There's no exploration of the psychological damage abuse causes, no discussion of resources for male victims, no serious examination of why men often don't report abuse. The episode uses male victimization as a premise for comedy, rather than genuinely exploring the issue. Why is this episode disturbing? It's scary because it demonstrates how society trivializes male victims of abuse. The episode itself participates in that trivialization, treating Quagmire's injuries and fear as punchlines. It's scary because it shows how Quagmire, a character who has committed numerous acts of sexual misconduct and assault throughout the series, is suddenly sympathetic when he's the victim. The hypocrisy is staggering and uncomfortable, and it's scary because the episode could have been an opportunity to address male victimization seriously, but instead chose to mine it for laughs, reinforcing the very attitudes that prevent male victims from seeking help. Both of these domestic violence episodes demonstrate Family Guy's struggle to address serious real-world issues within its comedic framework. The show wants credit for tackling important topics, but isn't willing to commit to treating them with the gravity they deserve. The result is episodes that make viewers deeply uncomfortable, not because they're effectively exploring darkness, but because they're fumbling their handling of genuine trauma. These aren't entertaining horror stories. They're reminders that some subjects require more care and understanding than Family Guy is capable of or willing to provide. As we move away from these deeply uncomfortable explorations of real-world abuse, let the tension ease from your shoulders. These episodes exist. They aired. They sparked important conversations, even if the episodes themselves were flawed. But we don't need to linger in their particular discomfort. There are other kinds of darkness to explore, other forms of horror that Family Guy has attempted. Let's shift to holiday horror, where the show takes celebrations meant to bring joy and twists them into nightmares. At least with holiday horror, we return to territory that's clearly fantastical, safely removed from the real-world trauma of the domestic abuse episodes. Holidays represent communal celebrations, moments of joy and togetherness, times when we're supposed to feel safe and happy, surrounded by family and tradition. That's precisely why horror set during holidays is so effective. The juxtaposition of cheerful decorations and festive music against darkness and violence creates cognitive dissonance that amplifies the horror. When Family Guy ventures into holiday territory, they often take the opportunity to subvert expectations and show the dark underbelly of celebration. Christmas and Halloween become vehicles for exploring fears and anxieties that normally stay buried beneath forced cheerfulness and social obligation. Season 9, Episode 7, December 12th, 2010. Road to the North Pole is technically a Christmas special, part of the show's Road to series, where Brian and Stewie embark on adventures together. These Road to episodes have a reputation for being darker and more emotionally resonant than typical Family Guy fare, often dealing with mature themes while maintaining the show's comedic sensibility. This particular entry takes the Santa Claus mythos and twists it into something genuinely disturbing, a vision of Christmas that will haunt you long after the episode ends. The episode begins, innocently enough, with Stewie visiting the mall Santa. He has specific requests, detailed demands for particular toys delivered in his characteristic imperious manner. But this mall Santa is tired, drunk, clearly just going through the motions. When Stewie realizes this Santa is fake, that there might not be a real Santa at all, he becomes distraught. Brian, trying to restore Stewie's faith in Christmas, makes a terrible mistake. He promises to take Stewie to the North Pole to meet the real Santa Claus. Of course, Brian doesn't believe Santa exists. He thinks they'll go on this journey. Stewie will realize Santa isn't real, and they'll go home. But in Family Guy's universe, Santa is real, and he is nothing like the jolly figure from songs and stories. Brian and Stewie's journey to the North Pole is arduous, involving stolen planes and harsh Arctic conditions. When they finally arrive at Santa's workshop, what they find is a scene of absolute horror. Santa exists, but he's a broken, depressed old man on the verge of suicide. The demands of modern Christmas, billions of children expecting presents, have pushed him past his breaking point. He begs Stewie to kill him, to end his suffering. This isn't the cheerful Saint Nick from Coca-Cola advertisements. This is a man crushed by impossible expectations, working a job that has become torture. But the real horror lies in Santa's workforce. The elves, those cheerful helpers from every Christmas story, have been forced to inbreed for generations to maintain their population. The results are nightmare fuel. The elves are grotesquely mutated, their bodies twisted by genetic damage, some barely functional, all clearly suffering. The animation doesn't shy away from depicting these deformities in disturbing detail. These creatures are alive and sentient enough to understand their situation, trapped in bodies ruined by generations of necessary incest, because Santa needed workers and had no other way to maintain his labor force. It's a vision of utilitarian ethics taken to their darkest extreme. The suffering of the elves is justified because it brings happiness to children worldwide. But seeing that suffering up close makes the cost unbearable. Then there are the reindeer. Those magical flying reindeer that pull Santa's sleigh, sung about in countless Christmas carols, have become feral carnivorous monsters. They're starving and vicious, attacking anything that moves. When Brian and Stewie encounter them, it's a genuine survival horror sequence. These aren't cute animals from children's books. They're apex predators, driven mad by hunger and captivity. The implications are horrifying. How long have they been this way? How has Santa been feeding them? The episode doesn't answer these questions, leaving viewers to imagine the worst. Seeing the catastrophic state of Christmas operations, Brian and Stewie decide to help. They offer to deliver presents in Santa's place, to give the old man a break. But they're woefully unprepared for the reality of the task. The sheer volume of children, the impossible logistics, the physical demands of the work, all of it overwhelms them within hours. They become increasingly desperate and violent in their attempts to fulfill the duty they've taken on. The breaking point comes when they enter a house to deliver presents and encounter the parents. Afraid of being caught, Brian and Stewie assault the homeowners, beating them unconscious or possibly killing them in front of their children. They've become home invaders, criminals committing violence to maintain the illusion of Santa Claus. This moment is genuinely horrifying. The children watch as these two intruders attack their parents. The trauma inflicted on those children, the violation of their home and safety during what should be a magical Christmas morning, represents the absolute inversion of what Christmas is supposed to mean. Brian and Stewie have become monsters in service of a tradition they don't even believe in. The road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intentions. The episode's resolution involves the family coming together to help Santa, somehow restoring his operations through the power of cooperation and renewed faith in Christmas. It's a heartwarming ending, grafted onto an episode that spent most of its runtime showing the absolute horror lurking beneath Christmas cheer. The tonal whiplash is intentional. The show wants us to feel the dissonance between the holiday we celebrate and the nightmare it would be if Santa Claus actually existed and had to fulfill the role we've assigned him. Why is this episode so disturbing? Multiple elements combine to create lasting unease. First, it takes something sacred to millions of people, the Santa Claus mythology, and reveals the horror inherent in its logistics. If Santa were real, if one person or organization really had to deliver presents to every child on Earth in a single night, the operation would require industrial-scale labor exploitation and environmental destruction. The episode makes explicit what we normally don't think about: the cost of maintaining our comfortable myths. Second, the body horror of the inbred elves is genuinely shocking. These aren't cute fantasy creatures. They're victims of genetic damage, suffering because Santa needed workers and chose to breed them like livestock. The casual cruelty, the normalization of their suffering as necessary for the greater good, reflects real-world arguments about acceptable suffering in service of societal needs. The elves' visible deformities make abstract ethical questions viscerally real. Third, the violence against the homeowners represents a complete violation of Christmas's supposed meaning. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, none of that matters when maintaining the illusion becomes more important than actual human well-being. Brian and Stewie's descent into violence shows how easily good intentions corrupt when faced with impossible demands. Fourth, there's existential horror in Santa's suicidal depression. This is a figure who represents hope and magic, reduced to begging for death. If Santa Claus wants to die, if the burden of bringing joy has become torture, What does that say about the sustainability of joy itself? The episode suggests that our happiness is built on the suffering of others, that someone always pays the price for our celebration. Behind the scenes, this episode required significant creative work to realize its dark vision. The character designs for the mutated elves needed to be disturbing without being so grotesque that they couldn't air. The animation of the feral reindeer required making them genuinely threatening while still recognizable as the figures from Christmas lore. Voice direction ensured that performances captured the horror and desperation of the situation. The musical score balanced Christmas music with ominous undertones, creating constant tension between expectation and reality. Reception was mixed, with some viewers appreciating the dark satire and others finding it too depressing for a Christmas special. Critics noted that the episode exemplified the Road to series' willingness to explore darker territory than typical Family Guy. The episode sparked discussions about the commercialization of Christmas, the ethics of maintaining mythologies that require systematic deception of children, and whether any tradition is worth the cost if you examine it too closely. For sleep content, this episode's horror works through sustained atmosphere. The North Pole setting is bleak and oppressive. The revelations about Santa, the elves, and the reindeer pile up, each one adding to the sense that something beloved has been corrupted. The violence against the homeowners provides a shocking spike of intensity. Throughout, the episode maintains a cold, desperate tone that matches its Arctic setting. You can let this darkness wash over you, experiencing the inversion of Christmas cheer without needing to analyze or resist it. Now, having explored how Family Guy warps Christmas into nightmare, we should examine how the show handles Halloween. But Halloween is already associated with horror and darkness, so how does Family Guy make it scary? The answer lies in taking suburban normalcy, the comfortable neighborhood streets where families feel safe, and revealing the secrets and violence lurking beneath that facade. Let's visit Spooner Street on Halloween night and discover what horrors hide behind friendly facades. Season 9, Episode 4, November 7th, 2010. Halloween on Spooner Street takes the traditional Halloween episode format and injects genuine darkness into what could have been a straightforward holiday celebration. The episode follows multiple storylines as various characters experience Halloween in Quahog, and each storyline reveals different kinds of horror lurking in this suburban community. The primary plot follows Stewie and Brian trick-or-treating through the neighborhood. Stewie is excited for his first real Halloween, dressed in a costume and ready to collect candy like all the other children. But the night takes dark turns as they encounter the reality of suburban Halloween. Not all houses are welcoming. Some neighbors are hostile or strange. The friendly facade of the neighborhood drops away after dark, revealing isolation, paranoia, and casual cruelty. Joe Swanson's storyline ventures into genuinely disturbing territory. The episode reveals dark secrets about Joe's past, things he's done in his role as police officer that haunt him. These aren't played entirely for laughs. There's genuine guilt and trauma in Joe's confession. The episode suggests that many of our neighbors carry hidden darkness, that the people we think we know have secrets that would horrify us if revealed. Joe's disabled status, usually played for comedy, becomes connected to this dark past, implying his injury wasn't just an accident, but potentially connected to his questionable actions. The neighborhood itself becomes a character in this episode. As night falls and Halloween celebrations begin, the familiar streets of Spooner Street transform. The darkness isn't just literal, but metaphorical. Every house holds secrets. Every neighbor has hidden depths. The episode creates paranoid atmosphere where trust dissolves, and the comfortable suburban setting reveals itself as a thin veneer over darkness. This is horror rooted in the vulnerability of community, the fear that the people you trust are strangers, that the place you feel safe is actually full of threats you haven't recognized. Peter's storyline involves Halloween party preparations and typical Peter hijinks, but even this lighter plot contains moments of darkness. The episode can't maintain pure comedy when it's established such an ominous atmosphere. Everything is tinged with unease, with the sense that something terrible could happen at any moment. The party becomes a gathering of people who don't really know each other, forced proximity, revealing friction and hostility. Meg's story involves her typical role as the family punching bag, but the Halloween setting amplifies the cruelty. The abuse she endures becomes more visible against the backdrop of a holiday about fear and darkness. What's usually subtext becomes text. Meg is terrified of her own family, trapped in a household that treats her with contempt. Halloween, when people are supposed to play act fear, reveals the genuine fear Meg lives with constantly. The episode's climax brings all storylines together in chaos. The boundaries between Halloween fun and genuine danger blur. Costumes make it impossible to tell friend from stranger. The darkness hides threats. What started as holiday celebration devolves into something more sinister, though the episode pulls back before crossing into truly dark territory. The resolution restores order, but the unease lingers. The episode has shown us the cracks in suburban normalcy, and we can't unsee them. Why does this episode work as horror? It taps into specific anxieties about community and belonging. We want to believe our neighborhoods are safe, that our neighbors are decent people, that the familiar streets where children play are protected spaces. Halloween episodes often play with these assumptions, but Halloween on Spooner Street goes further. It suggests that darkness isn't an intrusion from outside, but something that's always been present, hidden just beneath the surface. Our neighbors have always been strangers. The streets have always been dangerous. We just pretend otherwise, because acknowledging the truth would make normal life impossible. The suburban horror genre, exemplified by films like Halloween and A Nightmare on Elm Street, works by showing that evil exists in ordinary places. You're not safe just because you're home, just because you're in a nice neighborhood, just because you know your neighbors. Family Guy's version of suburban horror adds layers of satire about American suburban life, about the performance of normalcy that everyone maintains while hiding their true selves. The Halloween setting makes this performance explicit. Everyone is wearing masks, playing roles, pretending to be something they're not. Behind the scenes, this episode benefited from Halloween's natural association with horror. The writers could lean into dark themes without needing to justify them. Halloween episodes are expected to be creepy. The animation team used lighting and color to create atmosphere, with shadows and darkness dominating the visual palette. The voice acting played into the unease, with performances that maintained characteristic humor while allowing space for genuine menace. Reception was generally positive, with fans appreciating the Halloween atmosphere and the darker tone. Critics noted that the episode worked better than many Family Guy holiday specials because it committed to its premise rather than abandoning it halfway through for unrelated gags. The multiple storylines allowed for variety while maintaining cohesive atmosphere throughout. For sleep purposes, Halloween episodes work well because the holiday aesthetic is already designed to be atmospheric rather than shocking. The darkness, the costumes, the autumn atmosphere all create a mood that's intense, but not jarring. The suburban setting is familiar enough to be comfortable, even as the episode reveals darkness within that familiarity. You can drift through the various storylines, catching glimpses of different characters' Halloween experiences, without needing to track complex plots or solve mysteries. These holiday horror episodes demonstrate how Family Guy subverts expectations around celebration and joy. Christmas becomes a nightmare of impossible labor and genetic horror. Halloween reveals the darkness always present beneath suburban normalcy. The show takes moments that should be safe and happy, and finds the anxiety and fear lurking within them. It's a particularly effective form of horror because it corrupts things we're attached to, things that hold positive associations. After watching Road to the North Pole, you might find it harder to enjoy Christmas with quite the same innocent enthusiasm. After Halloween on Spooner Street, your own neighborhood might seem a little less safe after dark. But holidays are just scheduled celebrations, predictable moments when the horror can be confined to specific episodes. What about the ongoing, everyday psychological horror of simply existing in a dysfunctional family or in isolation from others? What about the terror that comes from your own mind turning against you? That's the territory we're exploring next, where the monsters aren't external but internal, where the threat isn't violence from others but the collapse of your own psychological defenses. The scariest monster wars are often the ones we can't escape because they live inside our own heads. Psychological horror doesn't rely on jump scares or gore. Instead, it explores the fragility of the human mind, the ways our perceptions can betray us, the terror of losing control over our own thoughts and emotions. When Family Guy ventures into psychological horror, the show typically locks characters in confined spaces or intense situations where their mental states deteriorate. These episodes create claustrophobic tension, forcing viewers to experience characters' psychological collapse in real time. The animated format doesn't diminish this horror. If anything, it amplifies it by visualizing internal states that live action couldn't easily depict. Season 8, Episode 17. May 2nd, 2010. Brian and Stewie represents one of Family Guy's most ambitious and disturbing experiments. The entire episode takes place in a single location, a bank vault where Brian and Stewie find themselves accidentally locked in overnight. There are no cutaway gags, no other characters appear, no B-plots or subplots. Just Brian and Stewie, trapped together, forced to confront their vulnerability and mortality in an increasingly desperate situation. It's a bottle episode in the truest sense, relying entirely on the central relationship and the claustrophobic setting to generate content. The episode begins with Brian taking Stewie to the bank where the Griffin family has a safety deposit box. Brian needs to retrieve something, and Stewie tags along. Through a series of mishaps, they end up locked inside the vault when the bank closes for the weekend. At first, this seems like a minor inconvenience. They're stuck, but they'll be found when the bank reopens Monday morning. They just need to wait it out. But as hours pass, the situation becomes increasingly dire. The first crisis is basic biology. Stewie is a baby. He wears diapers. And eventually, he needs his diaper changed. This creates an intimacy between the characters that's deeply uncomfortable to watch. Brian has to change Stewie's diaper, has to handle the bodily waste, has to perform caretaking duties that force him to confront Stewie's helplessness and his own disgust. The show doesn't treat this as a quick gag. The sequence is extended and detailed, emphasizing the unpleasantness and the vulnerability it creates for both characters. But then things get worse. Stewie becomes extremely ill, his body racked with pain from something he ate. He vomits repeatedly, violently. Brian tries to help, but there's nothing he can do except comfort Stewie and clean up the mess. The animation makes this viscerally unpleasant, showing bodily fluids and Stewie's suffering in detail. This isn't cartoon violence where characters bounce back instantly. This is sustained physical suffering, a baby in genuine distress with no help available. The lowest point of the episode comes with what fans refer to as the most disturbing scene Family Guy has ever aired. Stewie is so ill that he's produced excessive diarrhea, but there are no clean diapers left. They're trapped in the vault with no supplies. Brian suggests they just leave Stewie in the soiled diaper until they're rescued, but Stewie is in agony, the waste burning his skin. So Brian does something that viewers will never forget. He eats the contents of Stewie's diaper. He consumes feces to clean it out so Stewie won't be in pain. The show doesn't present this as comedy. There's no laugh track or comedic music. It's played as a moment of desperate sacrifice. Brian doing the most disgusting thing imaginable to ease a baby's suffering. The animation shows Brian's revulsion, his struggle not to vomit, his psychological trauma from forcing himself to do this. And Stewie, watching Brian sacrifice his dignity and endure this horror for him, feels genuine gratitude and connection. It's a moment of intimacy that comes from complete vulnerability, both characters stripped of all pretense and social performance. But the psychological horror deepens as the hours continue. Brian and Stewie begin discussing mortality, really grappling with the possibility that they might not be found in time, that they could die in this vault. The conversation turns to suicide. Brian reveals that he's attempted suicide before, that he's struggled with depression for years. He describes the methods he's considered, the darkness he lives with, the constant low-level death wish that colors his existence. This isn't played for laughs. This is a character confession that feels genuinely therapeutic, Brian finally admitting truths he's kept hidden. Stewie reciprocates with his own vulnerabilities. He talks about his isolation, his inability to connect with people despite his intelligence, his fear that he'll always be alone. The conversation becomes a mutual unburdening. Two characters who normally maintain elaborate facades, allowing themselves to be completely honest because they believe they're going to die. The episode suggests that genuine intimacy requires either tremendous courage or the belief that consequences don't matter because death is imminent. As they talk, they grow closer. Stewie opens up about loving Brian despite Brian's flaws. Brian admits how much Stewie means to him. They discuss their friendship, their adventures together, the ways they've changed each other. It's genuinely moving. This connection forged in desperation and isolation. The vault becomes both prison and confessional, a space where truth emerges because all other options are exhausted. Eventually, they hear sounds outside. A cleaning crew is working in the bank. Brian and Stewie scream for help, banging on the vault door. The door opens. They're saved. But the experience has changed them. They've seen each other at their worst and most vulnerable. They've shared intimacy that can't be taken back. The episode ends with them returning home, uncertain how to process what happened, what their relationship is now after that intense shared trauma. Why is this episode so psychologically horrifying? Multiple factors create its sustained intensity. First, the isolation and claustrophobia are oppressive. The vault is a small space with no escape. The camera stays in that space for the entire episode, making viewers feel trapped along with the characters. There's no relief, no cutting away to another location or storyline. We're stuck in that vault experiencing every moment of their ordeal. Second, the bodily horror and degradation are genuinely disturbing. Watching Brian eat feces isn't funny. It's traumatic. It violates fundamental taboos about bodily boundaries and hygiene. The show forces us to watch and to understand why he's doing it, which somehow makes it worse. We can't dismiss it as random gross-out humor because it's motivated by genuine care and desperation. Third, the suicide discussion is deeply uncomfortable because it's so honest and vulnerable. Brian's depression isn't a joke or a character quirk. It's a serious mental health issue that the episode treats with respect. Hearing a character discuss suicidal ideation in detail, describing specific methods and persistent thoughts about death, breaks the usual contract of animated comedy, where nothing is that serious or permanent. The show ventures into territory that live-action dramas handle carefully, and doing it in animation creates strange cognitive dissonance. Fourth, the intimacy forced by the situation is psychologically complex. Brian and Stewie care about each other, but their relationship is usually characterized by banter and adventure. This episode strips away all performance and protection, leaving them with only raw vulnerability. That forced intimacy is terrifying in its own way, because it can't be taken back or erased. They've seen too much of each other. Their relationship can't return to its previous casual state after this. Behind the scenes, this episode was recognized as a creative risk. Seth MacFarlane and Seth Green had to carry the entire episode with their voice performances, maintaining interest and emotional intensity without other actors or storylines to provide variety. The animation team had to make the vault feel claustrophobic and oppressive, while still allowing for visual interest across 22 minutes. The writing was remarkably tight, with every conversation serving to deepen character understanding or advance the emotional arc. Reception was divided. Some critics and fans praised the episode as Family Guy's finest achievement, a demonstration that the show could do genuine drama and character work when it chose to commit. Others felt uncomfortable with the intensity and the graphic content, feeling that the show had crossed into territory it shouldn't have explored. The episode won widespread acclaim for its ambition and execution, often appearing on lists of the show's best episodes. But it's also an episode that many viewers can only watch once because of how disturbing it is. For sleep content, this episode works through sustained intensity and inevitable progression. The situation steadily worsens in predictable ways. They're trapped, then hungry, then Stewie gets sick, then the bodily horror begins. Then the existential crisis arrives. That progression creates rhythm. The deep emotional conversations provide content that's complex enough to follow, but doesn't require problem solving or anticipation. You can drift through Brian's confession about suicide, through Stewie's fears about isolation, through their eventual bonding, experiencing the emotional journey without needing to engage actively. Now we've seen psychological horror through isolation and forced intimacy, but there's another form of psychological horror that Family Guy has explored: the toxic family dynamics that create psychological damage in everyone involved. When a family is dysfunctional, when emotional abuse is normalized, when every member is damaged and damaging others in turn, the home becomes a psychological torture chamber. Let's examine an episode that pulls back the curtain on the Griffin family's dysfunction and forces everyone, including viewers, to confront just how toxic this family really is. Season 10, Episode 2, October 2nd, 2011. Seahorse Seashell Party is an episode that polarized fans, with some considering it brilliant and others finding it unwatchable. The episode traps the Griffin family in their house during a hurricane, forcing them into proximity they normally avoid through routine and distraction. With no escape from each other, their dysfunction explodes into the open. What makes this episode particularly disturbing is that it doesn't resolve the issues it raises. It doesn't provide catharsis or growth. It simply reveals the toxicity and then finds a way to reestablish the status quo, suggesting that sometimes awareness of problems doesn't lead to solutions. The episode's main plot follows Meg finally standing up for herself. After years of abuse from her family, years of being the constant punching bag for everyone's cruelty, Meg snaps. She delivers a devastating speech detailing exactly how terrible her family is. She tells Chris he's going to be a failure because he's stupid and lazy. She tells Peter he's a terrible husband and father whose selfishness damages everyone around him. She tells Lois that her need to feel morally superior drives her to tear others down. She's not wrong about any of this. Everything Meg says is accurate. And the family, forced to hear these truths, begins to fall apart. Peter becomes depressed and withdrawn, unable to function because he's been forced to see himself clearly. Lois tries to maintain control, but can't manage both the household and her own emotional crisis. Chris descends into nihilistic despair, seeing no point in trying at anything since he's doomed to failure. The family system, which functioned by making Meg the scapegoat for all their problems, collapses when Meg refuses to play that role anymore. The abuse she endured wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was structural, necessary for maintaining everyone else's emotional equilibrium. This is genuinely horrifying as a psychological concept. Meg's revelation suggests that her abuse serves a function, that the family needs someone to hurt in order to avoid confronting their own issues. When Meg won't be the punching bag anymore, the family can't cope with reality. They fall apart because they have no other mechanism for dealing with their collective dysfunction. It's a damning portrait of how abusive family systems work, how every member becomes invested in maintaining the abuse because the alternative is facing truths they can't handle. The episode doesn't let Meg have her victory. Brian, who initially encouraged Meg to stand up for herself, realizes that the family is collapsing without their scapegoat. He convinces Meg that she needs to go back to her old role, to accept the abuse, because the family can't function otherwise. And Meg, after some resistance, agrees. She goes back to being the punching bag. She accepts her role as the person everyone else can abuse to feel better about themselves. The family immediately rebounds. Peter becomes cheerful again. Lois relaxes. Chris finds renewed energy. Everything returns to normal because Meg has sacrificed herself for everyone else's stability. This resolution is deeply disturbing because it's framed as the right choice. Brian explicitly tells Meg that this is what she needs to do. The episode suggests that sometimes maintaining dysfunctional systems is preferable to the chaos that comes from dismantling them. Meg's awareness of her abuse doesn't free her. It just makes her consciously choose to endure it, rather than unconsciously suffering through it. That's horror on an existential level. The idea that enlightenment doesn't lead to liberation, but to conscious self-sacrifice. The B plot of the episode involves Brian eating hallucinogenic mushrooms and having an extended bad trip. His hallucinations are visualized in disturbing detail. He sees walls melting, furniture transforming into monsters, reality becoming unstable and threatening. This could be played for comedy, but it's shot and animated as genuine horror. Brian is terrified, convinced he's dying, experiencing psychological hell. The trip lasts hours from his perspective, an eternity of fear and confusion. The connection between Brian's bad trip and Meg's family revelation isn't explicitly stated, but thematically they're linked. Both involve seeing reality clearly and finding that clarity unbearable. Brian sees the world without the filters that normally make it manageable, and it terrifies him. Meg sees her family clearly, without the rationalizations that normally make the abuse tolerable, and she can't handle that clarity. Both characters learn that sometimes ignorance really is bliss, that certain truths are too heavy to bear. Why is this episode so psychologically disturbing? It forces viewers to confront uncomfortable realities about family dysfunction and abuse. Many viewers saw elements of their own families in the Griffins' dynamics. The recognition that abuse can serve structural functions, that families can be invested in maintaining toxic patterns, that awareness doesn't automatically lead to change. These are difficult truths. The episode doesn't offer easy answers or happy resolutions. It shows dysfunction, reveals its mechanisms, and then restores it because that's the only option available to these characters. The episode also disturbs because it sympathizes with the abusers while acknowledging the abuse. Peter, Lois, and Chris are shown as genuinely unable to function without Meg as their scapegoat. They're not strong enough or healthy enough to face reality. The show asks us to understand why Meg chooses to sacrifice herself, to accept that her choice makes a certain terrible sense. That moral complexity, that refusal to provide clear villains or heroes, creates sustained discomfort. Brian's bad trip adds another layer of psychological horror through its visual intensity and existential dread. His hallucinations are genuinely frightening, showing how quickly our sense of reality can collapse when brain chemistry shifts. The animation makes his terror visceral, trapping us in his distorted perceptions without relief or escape. We experience his bad trip along with him, feeling his paranoia and confusion. Behind the scenes, this episode generated significant internal debate. The writers knew it would be controversial. The decision to have Meg return to her role as family punching bag, rather than escaping or forcing the family to change, was deliberate and divisive, even among the creative team. Some felt it was a brutally honest portrayal of how dysfunctional families really work. Others worried it sent the wrong message, suggesting that abuse victims should accept their abuse for the greater good. The animation team worked to make Brian's hallucination sequences genuinely psychedelic and disturbing. The voice acting required capturing real emotional intensity, particularly from Mila Kunis as Meg during her big confrontation scene. The episode's pacing deliberately creates claustrophobia, with the hurricane keeping everyone trapped and forcing extended scenes of family interaction without the usual cutaways for relief. Reception was polarized. Many critics praised the episode's willingness to examine the show's own problematic family dynamics, calling it a brave piece of self-criticism. Others found it too depressing, or felt that Meg's return to her abuse undercut any progressive message. The episode sparked extensive online discussion about family dysfunction, abuse dynamics, and whether animated comedies should tackle such serious psychological issues. For sleep purposes, this episode's intensity works through emotional exhaustion. The conflicts are so draining, the truths so heavy, that by the end, you feel psychologically tired along with the characters. Brian's bad trip provides surreal visual interest that's dreamlike in its instability. Meg's confrontation and subsequent resignation create narrative momentum that doesn't require viewer engagement to follow. You can experience the emotional weight without needing to analyze or problem solve, letting the heaviness wash over you as you drift towards sleep. These psychological horror episodes demonstrate Family Guy's capacity for genuine dramatic depth when it chooses to explore it. The Vault episode and the Hurricane episode both trap characters in confined spaces where psychological defenses collapse. Both force characters to confront truths they normally avoid. Both explore how intimacy and honesty can be terrifying in their own right, sometimes more frightening than external threats. The horror isn't violence or monsters, but the fragility of the human psyche. the ways we're all one bad situation away from psychological collapse. But sometimes, horror comes from sources we can't escape precisely because they're universal and inevitable. Everyone must confront mortality eventually. Everyone must face the reality that life is temporary, that death waits for all of us. When Family Guy explores death and the supernatural, they're tapping into our most primal fears, the anxieties that religion and philosophy have grappled with throughout human history. Let's see how the show personifies death and examines our relationship with our own mortality. Death is the ultimate unknowable, the one experience that everyone will have, but no one can describe. Every culture develops mythologies around death, ways to conceptualize and cope with mortality's inevitability. The personification of death, the Grim Reaper figure who comes to collect souls, appears across centuries and cultures because it makes the abstract concrete. If death is a being, a character, then maybe we can understand it, negotiate with it, even befriend it. Family Guy has featured death as a recurring character, sometimes playing him for comedy, but occasionally exploring genuine existential dread around mortality. These episodes tap into deep fears while using the animated format to visualize concepts that live action struggles to depict. Season 3, Episode 6, August 8th, 2001. Death Lives brings back Death, who first appeared in a much earlier episode. This time, the context is Peter's near-death experience. Peter has been lying on his insurance forms, and when his deception is discovered, he's about to lose his job. The stress of potentially losing his livelihood triggers a heart attack, and Peter finds himself confronting death himself. But this death is tired, overworked, dealing with his own problems. He's been doing this job for eternity, collecting souls, ferrying people to whatever comes next, and it's worn him down. Death decides to teach Peter a lesson about valuing life by showing him key moments from his past, particularly his relationship with Lois. This becomes a twisted version of It's a Wonderful Life, where Death shows Peter what really matters in his existence. But unlike that Christmas classic, this vision is filtered through Peter's flawed memory and Death's cynical perspective. The flashbacks reveal that many of Peter's supposed achievements or meaningful moments were actually based on luck or coincidence, rather than his own merit. What makes this episode unsettling is Death's characterization. He's not malevolent or terrifying in the traditional sense. He's just exhausted, doing a job that needs doing, maintaining cosmic order without enjoying it. There's no malice in his work, but there's no comfort either. Death doesn't care about you personally. You're just another soul to collect, another name on an infinite list. That indifference is horrifying in its own way. We want death to mean something, to be part of a greater purpose. But Family Guy's death suggests mortality might just be bureaucratic, a cosmic process as mundane as any other administrative task. The episode takes a strange turn when Death asks Peter for dating advice. He's interested in a woman, but doesn't know how to approach her. Peter helps him, and Death successfully asks her out. But then Peter has to give Death more relationship guidance, becoming his unwitting dating coach. This subplot is played for comedy, but there's something deeply weird about helping Death have a social life. It humanizes Death in uncomfortable ways, suggesting that the force that ends all life is just another lonely person looking for connection. The episode concludes with Peter learning to value his life and family, having been shown what really matters by Death himself. But the lesson feels hollow, because we know Peter will return to his usual selfish behavior within episodes. The show can't commit to lasting character growth, which means even confrontations with mortality don't fundamentally change people. That's its own kind of horror. The suggestion that awareness of death's inevitability still won't make us better, that we'll waste our limited time regardless of knowing it's limited. Season 2, Episode 6, March 18th, 2000. Death is a Bitch establishes Death as a character in Family Guy's universe. Peter has been lying on insurance forms, claiming various disabilities to get lower rates. When he actually does get injured, he refuses medical treatment because he doesn't want the insurance fraud discovered. This means Death comes calling, ready to collect Peter's soul. But Peter, in typical fashion, decides he doesn't want to die and refuses to go. This leads to Death chasing Peter around, trying to fulfill his duty, while Peter evades him through cartoon physics and sheer stubborn refusal to accept reality. The turning point comes when Death gets injured during the chase, spraining his ankle. Suddenly, the entity responsible for all mortality is incapacitated, unable to perform his duties. And the consequences are immediate and far-reaching. People stop dying. A man is hit by a bus and survives with horrific injuries, but can't die. Hospital patients linger in agony that should kill them, but doesn't. The world starts filling up with people who should be dead, but are trapped in broken bodies, suffering without end. This is where the episode ventures into genuine horror. We see the necessity of death, how it's not just a tragic ending, but an essential part of existence. Without death, there's no escape from suffering. Life without the possibility of death becomes torture. The episode makes explicit what we normally avoid thinking about. Death isn't just an ending, but also a mercy, a release from inevitable decay and pain. A world without death is a nightmare worse than mortality itself. Peter and Death eventually make peace, with Death recovering enough to resume his duties. The backlog of deaths happens all at once, a grim catching up as everyone who should have died suddenly does. Order is restored, but the episode has shown us something unsettling about the nature of existence. Death isn't an enemy to be defeated, but a necessary part of the system. Fighting death isn't heroic. It's futile and potentially catastrophic. These death episodes work as horror because they force confrontation with mortality in direct, personal ways. Death isn't abstract or distant. He's a character who interacts with the protagonists, who has his own personality and problems. This personification makes Death simultaneously more relatable and more alien. We can understand Death as a person, but that person's job is ending lives. The cognitive dissonance creates unease. The episodes also explore the paradox of death's necessity. We fear death and fight against it, but death serves essential functions. It ends suffering, makes room for new life, gives urgency and meaning to our limited time. A world without death would be stagnant and cruel, trapped in endless deterioration. But knowing death is necessary doesn't make it less frightening. The horror of mortality persists even when we understand its purpose. Behind the scenes, these episodes required establishing Death as a consistent character with his own personality and motivation. The voice acting by Norm Macdonald in later appearances gave Death a tired, world-weary quality that enhanced the character's appeal. The animation of Death himself, a skeletal figure in black robes, balanced between traditional Grim Reaper imagery and a more cartoonish, accessible design. Reception was generally positive, with fans enjoying Death as a recurring character who added existential weight to the show's usual comedy. The episodes demonstrated that Family Guy could explore serious themes like mortality and suffering while maintaining its comedic identity. Critics noted that the Death episodes worked better than many Family Guy attempts at profundity because they committed to their premises, rather than abandoning them for unrelated gags. For sleep content, these Death episodes work through their contemplative quality. Thinking about mortality can be strangely calming, a reminder of life's limits that puts daily anxieties in perspective. The episode's pacing is relatively slow, with extended conversations and philosophical discussions. Death's tired, bureaucratic characterization is almost soothing in its mundanity. You can drift through these episodes, catching fragments of Peter's conversations with Death, experiencing the existential themes without needing to fully engage. Now we've explored Death through direct personification, through meeting Death himself, and dealing with mortality as a character with agency. But there's another episode that takes supernatural horror and makes it visceral and immediate through found footage and paranormal investigation gone wrong. Let's visit an abandoned asylum and see what happens when the supernatural becomes real and dangerous. Season 14, Episode 4, October 11th, 2015. Peter Normal Activity takes the found footage horror genre, popularized by films like Paranormal Activity and The Blair Witch Project, and applies it to Family Guy's characters. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland decide to collaborate on a horror movie script. Rather than write it in comfort, they decide to visit an abandoned asylum for inspiration, bringing cameras to document their experience. It's the classic setup for found footage, horror. Characters enter a location they shouldn't, record everything that happens, and things go catastrophically wrong. The asylum itself is appropriately creepy, filled with decaying equipment, dark corridors, and an atmosphere of suffering and death. Abandoned mental institutions carry particular horror because of their history of abuse and neglect. These were places where people were locked away and forgotten, subjected to treatments that ranged from useless to torturous. The building itself holds that trauma, and the episode taps into those associations. Even before anything supernatural happens, the location is oppressive and disturbing. As they explore, strange things begin occurring. Equipment malfunctions. They hear sounds that shouldn't be there. Shadows move in impossible ways. The found footage format, with its shaky cameras and limited perspective, creates genuine tension. We see only what the characters' cameras capture, leaving enormous blind spots where anything could be lurking. The format forces viewers into the characters' vulnerable perspective, experiencing their confusion and fear firsthand. The supernatural activity escalates throughout the episode. What starts as minor oddities, things that could be explained away as coincidence or imagination, becomes undeniable. Objects move on their own. Apparitions appear in the footage when reviewed later. The building itself seems to be alive and hostile, trapping them inside and preventing escape. One member of the group ends up dead, killed by forces they don't understand and can't fight. This death isn't played for comedy. It's genuinely shocking, a reminder that the supernatural threat is real and lethal. The episode's horror lies in helplessness. The characters are completely outmatched by forces they can't comprehend. Traditional problem solving doesn't work when you're dealing with entities that don't follow physical laws. Fighting is useless. Running might not help if the building itself won't let you leave. The only option is to survive and hope the supernatural forces lose interest, which isn't much of a strategy. The found footage format adds layers of horror through its implications. The footage exists, which means it was recovered. Someone found these cameras and saw what happened. The characters know they're being recorded, know that their terror and possibly their deaths will be preserved for others to watch. There's something awful about knowing your suffering will become entertainment, that your worst moments will be replayed by strangers. The characters become characters in their own horror story, aware of the narrative while unable to escape it. Behind the scenes, this episode required different animation techniques to simulate found footage aesthetics. The shaky camera work, the occasional glitches and distortions, the night vision sequences, all had to be recreated in animation while maintaining visual clarity. Voice direction ensured performances captured genuine fear rather than just comedic panic. The sound design played a crucial role, using audio cues to suggest supernatural presence and create atmosphere. Reception was mixed, with some viewers appreciating the found footage homage and others finding the format gimmicky. Critics noted that the episode worked better as a horror piece than as comedy, with the scares being more effective than the jokes. The death of a main character, even temporarily, generated significant viewer reaction and demonstrated the show's willingness to take risks with its formula. For sleep purposes, the found footage format creates interesting texture. The shaky camera work and limited perspective require less active viewing than traditional shot compositions. The darkness and shadows that dominate the visual palette are inherently calming, despite the horror context. The supernatural threat is atmospheric rather than graphic, creating sustained tension without shocking violence. You can experience the creeping dread without needing to follow complex plot developments, drifting through the asylum exploration as the characters descend deeper into supernatural danger. These episodes about death and the supernatural explore our relationship with mortality and the unknown. Death as a character makes the abstract concrete, giving us someone to interact with and understand. The found footage, supernatural horror, makes the paranormal immediate and visceral, forcing characters into direct confrontation with forces beyond understanding. Together, these episodes tap into fundamental human fears about what happens when we die, whether anything exists beyond physical death, and how we should live knowing our time is limited. They're scary because they engage with questions that actually matter, issues we can't avoid thinking about, even if we wanted to. Now we've explored psychological horror, death, and the supernatural. But some Family Guy episodes are scary because of physical horror, the body in danger, or transformed in disturbing ways. Medical nightmares and body horror create visceral reactions that bypass intellectual defenses. Let's examine episodes where the human body itself becomes the source of terror. The body is our primary interface with reality, the vessel that contains our consciousness and mediates our experience of existence. When the body breaks down, transforms, or fails in catastrophic ways, we're forced to confront our own fragility and mortality. Medical horror taps into our deepest anxieties about illness, injury, and the medical system's ability to hurt as much as help. Body horror goes further, showing the flesh itself as alien and threatening, transforming in ways that violate natural order. Family Guy has explored both medical horror and body horror in episodes that make viewers squirm with visceral discomfort. Season 9, Episode 8, December 12th, 2010. New Kidney in Town confronts medical horror through a scenario that's uncomfortably plausible. Peter does something stupid, as he always does, and ends up drinking kerosene. This causes immediate kidney failure. Without a transplant, he will die. The episode sets up what should be a straightforward medical drama. Find a donor, perform the surgery, Peter survives. But Family Guy twists this into something far more disturbing. Lois isn't a match for kidney donation. Their children can't be considered. They're too young, and the family won't allow them to donate. So who can save Peter? Brian. Somehow, despite being a completely different species, Brian's kidneys are a perfect match for Peter. This makes no biological sense, but the show hand-waves the impossibility, because the point isn't scientific accuracy. The point is creating an impossible ethical dilemma. Here's where it gets truly horrifying. Because Brian is smaller than Peter, a single kidney won't be enough. To save Peter's life, Brian would have to donate both his kidneys. This would almost certainly kill Brian. Even if the surgery somehow succeeds, and Peter survives with dog kidneys keeping him alive, Brian would die from kidney failure. The surgery is essentially asking Brian to sacrifice his life to save Peter's. Brian agrees to do it. Without hesitation, without demanding anything in return, he consents to die, so Peter can live. This reveals depths of friendship and love that the show usually keeps hidden beneath comedic surface. Brian genuinely loves Peter, despite all his flaws and stupidity. He's willing to give up his existence so Peter can continue. The episode forces us to consider what we'd do in Brian's situation, whether we'd sacrifice ourselves for a friend, and whether anyone has the right to ask that of someone they love. The goodbye scene between Peter and Brian is genuinely heartbreaking. They're saying farewell before the surgery, knowing they won't both survive. Peter is crying, trying to express gratitude he doesn't have words for. Brian is calm, resigned, treating this as just something that needs to be done. They hug, and the weight of that embrace carries all the unspoken emotion between them. It's one of Family Guy's most moving moments, made more powerful by the show's usual unwillingness to engage with sincere emotion. Then, at the last minute, the episode reveals that Peter's kidney failure was somehow reversible through nonsensical cartoon logic. Brian doesn't have to die. Peter will be fine. The medical crisis resolves itself, and everyone goes home happy. This last-minute save undermines the emotional weight the episode built, suggesting that the sacrifice and genuine love expressed were all for nothing, because consequences don't stick in Family Guy's universe. But the episode remains disturbing because it showed us that depth, that willingness to sacrifice, that profound love between characters we usually see in purely comedic contexts. We saw Brian prepared to die. We saw Peter accepting that gift while being destroyed by having to accept it. The episode revealed emotional truths that can't be unseen. Even if the specific crisis was averted, the medical horror becomes psychological horror. The fear that love might demand sacrifices we're not strong enough to make. Season 10, Episode 16, April 1st, 2012. Killer Queen ventures into different territory of horror, the slasher film. A serial killer is targeting overweight teenagers in Quahog. The murders are presented with unusual gravity for Family Guy. There's genuine menace to the killer, genuine fear in the potential victims. The episode creates atmosphere more associated with horror films than animated comedy. Chris, being an overweight teenager himself, becomes a potential target. The family has to protect him while the police investigate the murders. The investigation reveals details about the killer's methods and motivations, building a profile of someone who specifically targets a vulnerable population. There's something particularly cruel about a killer who preys on teenagers already dealing with body image issues and social stigma. The visual aesthetic of the episode deliberately references horror album covers and slasher film posters. The murders are stylized, presented as artistic compositions rather than realistic violence. This creates strange emotional distance. We're aware these are murders, that teenagers are dying, but the artistic presentation makes it feel staged and unreal. The show is commenting on how we consume violence as entertainment, how aesthetic considerations can override ethical ones when we're viewing fiction. The killer's identity, when revealed, adds psychological complexity. This isn't random violence, but targeted aggression driven by specific motivations. The episode explores how killers rationalize their actions, how they justify taking lives. There's no attempt to make the killer sympathetic, but there is an attempt to make them comprehensible. That understanding is disturbing in its own way, because it suggests that anyone, given the right circumstances and mental state, could become a monster. The episode's resolution involves stopping the killer through typical animated comedy means, with violence and absurdity. But the atmosphere created earlier lingers. The episode took teenage victims seriously, showed genuine fear and mourning, created actual stakes. Even when resolved through comedy, those moments of genuine horror remain unsettling. Season 11, Episode 4, November 6th, 2011. Brian the Closer features one of Family Guy's most graphically violent scenes, Peter dragging Brian behind his car. This isn't stylized cartoon violence where characters bounce back instantly. The animation shows Brian's body being torn apart by the road, his skin shredding, his body breaking. It's genuinely difficult to watch, pushing boundaries of what animated television can show. The scene occurs because Peter wants a toy that Brian is holding, a ridiculous motivation that makes the violence even more horrifying. This isn't punishment for genuine wrongdoing or conflict driven by real stakes. It's casual cruelty from Peter's thoughtless selfishness. The fact that Brian survives and eventually heals doesn't erase the visceral impact of watching his body destroyed in detail. This scene works as body horror because it shows the fragility of flesh in graphic detail. We see Brian's body failing, breaking, being reduced to meat and blood. The animation doesn't cut away or suggest violence through implication. It shows the damage directly, forcing viewers to witness every moment. That commitment to depicting suffering makes it genuinely traumatic for many viewers. These body horror and medical nightmare episodes share a focus on physical vulnerability. Peter's kidney failure, the murdered teenagers, Brian's broken body, all remind us that we're fragile meat machines that can fail or be destroyed at any moment. The body we depend on for everything can turn against us through illness, can be targeted by others through violence, can be sacrificed for love. That vulnerability is terrifying because we can't escape our bodies. We're trapped in flesh that's ultimately temporary and breakable. Behind the scenes, these episodes required animators and writers willing to push boundaries of what Family Guy typically showed. The kidney donation episode needed genuine emotional weight and performances that could sell sincere love and sacrifice. The serial killer episode required building atmosphere and tension unusual for the show's format. The Brian dragging scene needed animation detailed enough to be shocking, while technically acceptable for broadcast television. Reception varied widely. Some viewers appreciated the show's willingness to explore darker territory and create genuine horror within its comedic framework. Others found these episodes too disturbing, feeling that they crossed lines unnecessarily and created content that wasn't fun to watch. Critical Response often noted the tonal inconsistencies. The way these episodes tried to be both serious horror and typical Family Guy comedy without fully committing to either mode. For sleep content, these body horror episodes work through their visceral intensity. The physical suffering depicted is detailed enough to be engaging, but horrible enough that active watching becomes difficult. Your brain might drift away during the worst moments, creating natural breaks in attention. The medical terminology and procedural elements provide content that's complex enough to follow but doesn't require problem solving. You can experience the horror through the narrative description, understanding what's happening without needing to visualize every detail yourself. Now we've explored horror rooted in bodily vulnerability and medical crisis. But Family Guy's darkness extends beyond individual suffering into systemic issues, examining how relationships themselves can become toxic and how power dynamics create suffering. Let's look at episodes that examine twisted relationships and dark desires that push boundaries of acceptability. Relationships should provide connection, support, and love. But when power imbalances exist, when motivations are selfish, when boundaries are violated, relationships become prisons. Family Guy has explored various forms of relationship dysfunction, from inappropriate age gaps to workplace harassment, to family members behaving in ways that violate fundamental taboos. These episodes are uncomfortable because they reflect real ways that relationships can become toxic or abusive, showing darkness that exists in reality rather than just fiction. Season 12, Episode 14, April 27th, 2014. Fresh Air presents a premise that's deeply disturbing from the outset. Peter trying to marry his own son. The motivation is financial. Peter learns he can inherit Carter Pewterschmidt's fortune if he marries into the family, but Lois is already his wife, so that won't work. His solution is to divorce Lois and marry Chris instead, allowing him to access the inheritance while technically following the letter of the law regarding marriage requirements. The episode plays this for dark comedy, but the implications are horrifying. Peter is attempting to manipulate his teenage son into a legal marriage for financial gain. Chris doesn't understand what's happening, doesn't comprehend the inappropriate nature of what Peter is suggesting. There are implications of grooming, of parental authority being abused to manipulate a minor into an inappropriate relationship. Even though the marriage wouldn't be consummated, the very fact that Peter is pursuing it reveals how far he'll go when money is involved. Lois tries to stop the marriage, recognizing how wrong it is. But Peter is determined, seeing Chris as a means to an end rather than as his son who deserves protection. The legal proceedings move forward, with Chris uncomfortable but unable to articulate why this feels wrong. He trusts his father and doesn't have the maturity to recognize the manipulation and abuse happening. The episode eventually reveals that the whole situation was a misunderstanding or a trick, that Peter won't actually gain anything from marrying Chris. The marriage is called off, and things return to normal. But the episode showed us Peter willing to manipulate his own child for money, willing to violate fundamental family boundaries, willing to pursue something deeply inappropriate because he thought it would benefit him. That revelation about his character is disturbing even after the specific crisis is resolved. This episode is scary because it depicts emotional abuse and manipulation within families. Parents have enormous power over children, and when that power is used selfishly, children suffer psychological damage. Peter's willingness to use Chris for financial gain, to potentially traumatize his own son for inheritance money, shows depths of selfishness that are genuinely monstrous. The episode treats this as comedy, but the underlying situation is horrifying. Season 8, Episode 14, March 28th, 2010. Peter Asment tackles workplace sexual harassment, but with an unusual twist. The victim is Peter, and the harasser is his female boss, Angela. This should be a straightforward exploration of how sexual harassment is wrong regardless of gender. Instead, the episode struggles with how to present male victimization, often undercutting its own serious moments with jokes that suggest Peter should enjoy the attention. Angela makes her sexual interest in Peter explicit. She touches him inappropriately, makes sexual comments, uses her position of power to coerce him into uncomfortable situations. Peter is genuinely frightened and revolted, not interested in Angela, but unable to refuse her without risking his job. This is textbook sexual harassment, an abuse of power that creates a hostile work environment. The episode shows Peter's increasing desperation as Angela's harassment escalates. He can't report her because she's the boss. He can't quit because his family depends on his income. He feels trapped and violated. Classic experiences of harassment victims. The show occasionally treats this seriously, acknowledging the genuine harm being done. But then, the episode undercuts itself with jokes suggesting that male victims should enjoy female sexual attention, that Peter is somehow failing at masculinity by not wanting to sleep with his boss. These jokes reinforce the very attitudes that prevent male victims from being taken seriously, suggesting that harassment is only real when men do it to women. The mixed messaging makes the episode uncomfortable in ways it doesn't seem to intend. The resolution involves Peter finally escaping Angela's harassment through plot contrivances, rather than through systemic solutions, like reporting to HR or legal action. The episode doesn't explore how workplaces should handle harassment, or what resources exist for victims. It treats the harassment as a temporary problem that resolves itself rather than a serious issue requiring structural change. These episodes about twisted relationships reveal discomfort around power imbalances and boundary violations. Whether it's parental manipulation, workplace harassment, or other forms of relationship dysfunction, these scenarios tap into real anxieties about how people we trust or depend on can hurt us. The horror isn't supernatural or fantastical. It's human, rooted in the ways people abuse power and violate trust. The scariest element is how the show itself seems uncertain about how seriously to take these issues. Should Peter marrying Chris be pure dark comedy or a serious examination of parental manipulation? Should Angela's harassment of Peter be played for laughs or treated as genuine victimization? The episodes vacillate, creating tonal whiplash that leaves viewers uncertain how to react. That uncertainty becomes its own form of discomfort. Behind the scenes, these episodes presumably generated discussion about boundaries and taste. The writers clearly wanted to explore dark territory, but struggled with how far to push and how seriously to treat the subject matter. The performances had to balance comedy with genuine discomfort, making characters both funny and genuinely disturbed by their situations. Reception was largely negative, with critics and viewers finding these episodes more uncomfortable than entertaining. The attempts at dark comedy often fell flat because the subject matter was too serious for jokes to land properly. Advocacy groups criticized both episodes for their handling of serious issues, noting that using sexual harassment and parental manipulation as comedy premises trivializes real harm. For sleep content, these episodes work through persistent discomfort rather than peaks of horror. The situations are consistently wrong, creating sustained unease without dramatic spikes. The moral confusion, the unclear messages, the tonal inconsistencies, all create a fog of discomfort that's paradoxically calming in its consistency. Your brain doesn't need to stay alert for jump scares or sudden revelations. The wrongness is constant and predictable, almost soothing in its reliability. Now we've explored relationship dysfunction and power abuse. But Family Guy's darkness extends into examining how families can be toxic in ways that destroy everyone involved. How attempting to escape dysfunction can reveal that you've already been irreparably damaged. Let's look at episodes where family dynamics themselves become horror. We've already touched on family dysfunction in earlier sections, but some episodes deserve specific attention for how they examine the ways families can psychologically destroy their members. These aren't episodes about external threats or supernatural horror. They're about the slow, grinding damage of living in dysfunctional family systems, the accumulation of small cruelties and boundary violations that eventually break people. The horror is intimate and inescapable because you can't get away from your family, especially when you're too young or too damaged to leave. Season 9, Episode 12, January 30th, 2011. The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair focuses on Joe Swanson's increasing obsession with revenge against someone who beat him in a competition. The episode tracks Joe's psychological descent as his need for vengeance consumes him. What starts as wounded pride transforms into genuine madness, with Joe devoting all his energy to destroying his rival. The escalating revenge becomes disturbing as Joe loses all perspective. He's willing to hurt innocent people, destroy property, risk his career and relationships, all to settle this perceived debt. The episode shows how obsession warps priorities, how the need for revenge can become more important than anything healthy or constructive. Joe's descent mirrors how abuse victims sometimes become abusers themselves, how being hurt leads to hurting others in an endless cycle. The violence in the episode is extensive and graphic. Joe and his rival engage in brutal confrontations that show real damage, real pain. These aren't cartoon battles where characters bounce back instantly. The injuries accumulate, the hatred intensifies, and both men become hollowed out by their mutual obsession. The episode suggests that some grudges can't be satisfied, that revenge doesn't actually heal wounds, but just creates new ones. Season 4, Episode 20, April 16th, 2006. Patriot Games shows Peter joining the New England Patriots football team and engaging in extreme violence on the field. What could be a simple sports comedy becomes disturbing through the graphic depiction of injuries and Peter's sadistic enjoyment of hurting people. He tackles opponents with excessive force, breaking bones, causing serious harm, and reveling in the destruction. The episode's most infamous sequence involves Peter brutally attacking Tom Brady, the Patriots' star quarterback. The beating is extended and detailed, showing Brady's body breaking under the assault. It's played for comedy, but the violence is so graphic and sustained that comedy gives way to genuine discomfort. We're watching a prolonged assault, and even though it's animated, even though we know it's not real, the visual detail makes it viscerally unpleasant. The episode examines how sports culture can normalize and celebrate violence. Peter's violent behavior is rewarded, encouraged by fans and teammates who love seeing him destroy opponents. The crowd cheers as he injures people. The team celebrates his brutality. The episode satirizes American sports culture's relationship with violence, but it also demonstrates how systems can make violence seem acceptable or even admirable when it serves entertainment purposes. These episodes about violence and obsession show characters losing themselves to destructive impulses. Joe's revenge quest and Peter's violent sports career both demonstrate how easily people can be consumed by darkness when they let their worst impulses guide them. The family dynamics that enabled these psychological breaks are implicit. Peter's family doesn't effectively intervene to stop his violence, and Joe's family can't reach him through his obsession. For sleep content, these episodes provide intense action and violence that creates sensory overload in some ways, while being emotionally distant enough not to require deep engagement. The escalating confrontations follow predictable patterns of action cinema, providing familiar structure. You can drift through the violence, understanding its narrative function without needing to watch every moment carefully. Now we've examined family dysfunction through various lenses, from toxic relationships to violence to obsession. But Family Guy has also created episodes that parody horror specifically, using familiar horror movie formats and tropes to create content that's scary through recognition and subversion. Let's explore episodes that are horror parodies, where the show directly engages with the horror genre itself. Parody can be an effective vehicle for horror when done well. By recreating the structure and aesthetic of famous horror stories, parodies can evoke the same feelings those originals created while adding layers of commentary or comedy. Family Guy has produced several episodes that function as horror parodies, from Stephen King adaptations to Halloween specials that embrace horror aesthetics. These episodes are scary because they're channeling genuine horror through Family Guy's lens, creating content that works both as parody and as horror in its own right. Season 19, Episode 5, October 18th, 2020. Happy Halloween deals with a clone storyline where Peter's duplicate tries to take over his life. The premise draws from science fiction horror about identity and replacement, tapping into fears about who we really are and whether we could be replaced without anyone noticing. The clone is identical to Peter in every way, making it impossible for others to tell them apart. The horror comes from watching Peter fight for his own identity against someone who can perfectly impersonate him. If you can be replaced by someone identical, what makes you special or irreplaceable? The episode doesn't deeply explore these philosophical questions, but it raises them through its premise. The clone's existence threatens Peter's relationships, his place in his family, his entire sense of self. The visual aesthetic references body horror films like The Thing and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the threat comes from beings that look human but aren't. The paranoia created by not knowing who's the real Peter and who's the clone builds tension even within a comedic framework. The episode uses darkness and visual confusion to maintain uncertainty about which Peter is which. Season 2, Episode 9, December 20th, 1999. If I'm Dying. I'm Lying features Peter's lies literally bringing down God's wrath on his family. When Peter claims Chris has a terminal illness to get something he wants, the lie spirals out of control until he's forced to fake a miracle healing. But his continued lying and manipulation anger God, who begins sending biblical plagues down on the Griffin household. The supernatural punishment becomes increasingly severe. Locusts, frogs, boils, darkness, all the plagues from Exodus manifest in modern Quahog because of Peter's dishonesty. The family suffers through these supernatural afflictions, unable to escape divine judgment. This is cosmic horror in a sense, the idea that higher powers exist and they're angry. That human behavior can trigger supernatural consequences beyond our control or understanding. The episode draws heavily from biblical horror, the Old Testament God who punishes transgression with terrible force. There's no negotiating with this power, no way to fight back or escape. Peter's only option is to confess and repent, to acknowledge his lies and accept consequences. The episode creates genuine tension around whether God will accept Peter's repentant silence or continue punishing the family for his sins. Season 7, Episode 15, May 3rd, 2009. Three Kings presents 3 segments based on Stephen King stories: Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption. While these aren't all traditionally horror stories, King's work always carries dark undercurrents, and Family Guy leans into those darker elements. The Stand By Me segment follows the group searching for a dead body, maintaining the original's themes of mortality and coming of age. Seeing death up close, confronting the reality that bodies are just empty vessels once life leaves them, creates existential unease. The episode doesn't shy away from the corpse's presence or what it represents. The Misery segment, which in King's version is absolutely a horror story about captivity and obsession, gets played more for comedy, but still captures the essential horror of being trapped by someone who claims to love you, but really wants to control and own you. The dynamic between captor and captive, the physical helplessness combined with psychological manipulation, translates even into Family Guy's parodic version. These parody episodes demonstrate Family Guy's awareness of horror traditions and ability to recreate them with varying degrees of success. The parodies work when they capture what made the originals scary, while adding new elements through Family Guy's perspective. They fail when they focus too much on surface-level references without understanding the underlying horror mechanics. Behind the scenes, these episodes required writers and animators familiar with the horror films and stories being parodied. The goal was creating content recognizable to fans of the originals, while making it work within Family Guy's universe. Voice direction needed to capture genuine horror atmosphere while maintaining the show's comedic identity. The animation had to reference specific films' visual styles while remaining distinctly Family Guy. Reception depended heavily on how well each parody executed its concept. Successful parodies earned praise for their understanding of horror and clever adaptation. Unsuccessful ones were criticized for relying on shallow references without capturing what made originals effective. Horror fans often appreciated these episodes more than general audiences because they caught more references and understood the homages being paid. For sleep content, parody episodes work because they follow familiar structures from well-known stories. Your brain recognizes the patterns even if you don't consciously remember the originals. The predictable story beats, the expected horror moments, all create comfortable rhythm despite scary content. You can drift through these episodes, catching references if you know them or just experiencing the stories if you don't. Either way, following comprehensible narratives toward inevitable conclusions. Now we've seen Family Guy engage directly with horror through parody and homage. But there's another category of disturbing content. Episodes that deal with alternate realities and timeline manipulation, creating existential dread about identity, choice, and the nature of reality itself. Let's explore episodes where the multiverse reveals darkness through infinite variation. The concept of alternate realities and parallel timelines opens up unique possibilities for horror. If every choice creates a branching timeline, if infinite versions of you exist across the multiverse, what does that mean for identity and meaning? Are you special or just one iteration among countless others? Family Guy has explored these concepts through episodes featuring alternate timelines, parallel universes, and the psychological implications of confronting your other selves. Season 11, Episode 21, May 20th, 2013. Roads to Vegas features Brian and Stewie accidentally creating duplicates of themselves through a malfunctioning teleportation device. The original Brian and Stewie take a plane to Las Vegas, while their duplicates, created by the machine, are teleported there instantly. Neither pair knows the other exists initially, but they're both in Vegas at the same time, creating potential for confusion and conflict. The horror emerges as the two versions of Brian and Stewie's lives diverge dramatically. The duplicates who were teleported win big at gambling, have amazing luck, live out fantasy Las Vegas experiences. Meanwhile, the originals who took the plane encounter nothing but misery and failure. Their Vegas trip is a disaster. When they eventually encounter their duplicates and realize what happened, jealousy and resentment build. Why do the duplicates get the good timeline while the originals suffer? This creates existential dread about luck and fate. If the only difference between success and failure is which version of you exists in which timeline, if your happiness depends entirely on cosmic chance rather than choices or merit, what's the point of trying? The episode suggests that we're all just one random event away from completely different lives, that the vast gulf between happiness and misery can come down to pure luck. The duplicates' timeline becomes increasingly dark as the originals plot to switch places or eliminate their doubles. There's discussion of murder, of killing your alternate self to take over their better life. This raises disturbing questions about identity and replaceability. If you killed your duplicate and took their place, would you really be stealing someone else's life, or just claiming a life that could have been yours? The episode doesn't resolve these philosophical questions, just raises them through its premise. Season 2, Episode 13, May 9th, 2000. Road to Rhode Island involves Brian traveling to retrieve Stewie from his grandparents' house, leading to revelations about Brian's traumatic childhood. The episode includes extended flashbacks showing Brian's abandonment and adoption, the psychological damage from being separated from his mother, the ways early trauma shapes who we become. The darkness comes from realizing that Brian's cynicism and dysfunction stem directly from childhood trauma he's never properly processed. He was abandoned as a puppy, separated from his mother, forced to adapt to a world that didn't want him. Those experiences created the defense mechanisms and coping strategies that define his adult personality. The episode makes explicit that Brian is damaged, that his attempts to seem sophisticated and intellectual are covers for deep insecurity and pain. The road trip format allows extended time for Brian and Stewie to bond, for Brian to open up about his past in ways he normally won't. Stewie, despite his own issues, becomes Brian's therapist and support system. The emotional vulnerability displayed is unusual for Family Guy, showing genuine hurt and the beginning of healing. But the episode also suggests that some wounds never fully heal, that Brian will always carry his childhood abandonment with him. These alternate reality and timeline episodes create horror through implications about identity and meaning. If infinite versions of you exist, are you special? If your happiness depends on random chance rather than your choices, do your choices matter? If childhood trauma determines your adult personality, are you really in control of who you are? These existential questions don't have comforting answers, and the episodes don't pretend they do. Behind the scenes, these episodes required carefully tracking multiple versions of characters, ensuring visual and vocal distinctions that would help audiences follow which version was which. The philosophical themes needed integration into the adventure plots without overwhelming the comedy. The emotional depth required performances that could handle both genuine vulnerability and the show's typical humor. Reception was generally positive, with fans appreciating the road to episode's willingness to explore darker emotional territory. Critics noted that these episodes often represented Family Guy at its best, when it committed to character development and emotional storytelling, rather than relying solely on gags. The existential themes resonated with viewers who appreciated the show engaging with genuinely interesting ideas. For sleep content, these reality-bending episodes work through their contemplative qualities. Thinking about identity and choice, about luck and trauma, about alternate versions of ourselves living different lives, can be oddly meditative. The concepts are complex enough to engage without requiring active problem solving. You can drift through philosophical discussions and alternate timeline revelations, your mind processing the ideas without needing to stay fully alert. Now we've explored alternate realities and the existential horror they create. But there's one more category of disturbing Family Guy content we need to examine: the absurd horror. Episodes where the premise itself is so bizarre and wrong that it creates unique discomfort. Let's look at the strangest, most unsettling episodes that defy easy categorization. Some horror comes from the incomprehensible, from scenarios so bizarre that normal logic breaks down. Absurd horror creates discomfort through wrongness itself, through premises that shouldn't exist, but do. Family Guy, being an animated comedy with loose continuity and willingness to try anything, has produced episodes that fit this category perfectly. These are stories that couldn't happen anywhere else. Nightmares too strange for typical horror, but too disturbing to dismiss as pure comedy. Season 11, Episode 10, January 8th, 2013. Brian's play features Stewie seeking revenge on Brian for insulting one of Stewie's plays. Stewie's revenge takes the form of writing a dark, disturbing theatrical production that's essentially torture designed to humiliate and psychologically destroy Brian. The play depicts Brian in horrifying scenarios, revealing his worst fears and insecurities on stage for an audience. The meta-horror of revenge through art is genuinely unsettling. Stewie uses creative expression as a weapon, crafting a theatrical experience designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. The play works as both entertainment for the audience and torture for Brian, who has to watch himself depicted in the worst possible light, his flaws magnified and distorted until they become monstrous. The episode explores how art can be weaponized, how creative talent can be turned toward destruction rather than creation. Stewie's revenge is elegant and cruel, using Brian's own appreciation for theater against him. There's something horrifying about being forced to watch an artistic interpretation of your worst self, seeing your failures and flaws transformed into entertainment for others. The psychological damage is extensive and lasting. The various unmentioned bonus episodes and segments scattered throughout Family Guy's history also deserve recognition. The banned episode, Partial Terms of Endearment, which dealt with abortion in ways that made network executives refuse to air it, exists in this category of content that was deemed too dark or controversial for broadcast. The episode's very existence as forbidden content makes it fascinating and frightening, a piece of Family Guy lore that most people have never seen, but everyone knows about. The various viewer mail segments that occasionally appear allow for horror vignettes that don't need to follow the show's usual format. These short segments can experiment with different horror styles, from classic monster movies to psychological thrillers to body horror, without needing to sustain the content for a full episode. The brevity allows for intensity that wouldn't work across 22 minutes. The Something 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 Dark Side series, Family Guy's extended Star Wars parodies, contains moments of genuine darkness hidden within the comedy. The violence of space battles, the tragedy of characters dying, the existential horror of galactic scale conflict, all appear in these episodes filtered through Family Guy's perspective. While primarily comedies, these episodes contain enough authentic darkness from the source material that they create genuine tension and horror at points. These absurd horror episodes demonstrate Family Guy's willingness to venture into territory that defies easy categorization. They're too strange for typical horror, too disturbing for pure comedy, existing in an uncomfortable middle ground. The absurdity doesn't diminish the horror. If anything, It amplifies it by making the scenarios feel unstable and unpredictable. When anything can happen, when normal rules don't apply, the viewer has no safe assumptions to rely on. Behind the scenes, these experimental episodes often came from writers wanting to try something different, to push boundaries and see what Family Guy could be when freed from formula. The animation team had to realize bizarre concepts that might not make immediate sense, trusting that the strangeness itself would be compelling. Voice actors had to sell moments that ranged from absurd to genuinely disturbing, often within the same scene. Reception varied wildly depending on individual viewer tolerance for the absurd and disturbing. Some found these episodes brilliant, appreciating the risks taken and the unique content created. Others found them confusing or disturbing in unpleasant ways, feeling that the show had lost its way when it ventured into such strange territory. Critical response often focused on ambition rather than quality, recognizing that these episodes attempted something different even when execution was flawed. For sleep content, absurd horror works through its dreamlike quality. The scenarios don't follow normal logic, creating a surreal atmosphere similar to actual dreams. Your sleeping brain might not distinguish clearly between the strange content and your own dream imagery, allowing smooth transitions between waking and sleeping states. The strangeness is expected in these episodes, making it less jarring and potentially more calming than realistic horror that violates expectations of normalcy. These final episodes of absurd and experimental horror demonstrate Family Guy's range and willingness to take creative risks. From revenge through theater to banned content to experimental formats, these episodes show that the scariest moments sometimes come from the unexpected, from content that shouldn't work but somehow does, from nightmares too strange to exist anywhere, but in Family Guy's bizarre universe. Now we've journeyed through 30 episodes and explored the full spectrum of Family Guy's darkest content. We've seen murders and ghosts, psychological breakdowns, and body horror, family dysfunction, and existential dread. We've experienced violence and vulnerability, cruelty, and rare moments of genuine compassion. We've watched characters at their worst, and occasionally at their best, confronting darkness, both external and internal. As we prepare to close out this long journey through Quahog's nightmares, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've seen and what it means. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through Family Guy's darkest territories. We've spent hours together exploring 30 episodes that represent the show at its most disturbing, its most psychologically complex, its most willing to venture into genuine horror. From the isolated mansion of And Then There Were Fewer, where beloved characters died permanently, to the supernatural nightmares of Petergeist and Peter Normal Activity, to Stewie's matricidal fantasies finally realized in his simulation, we've witnessed darkness in many forms. We examined how the show tackles real-world horror through episodes like Screams of Silence, which attempted to address domestic violence and sparked controversy through its execution. We explored holiday horror in Road to the North Pole, which revealed the nightmare behind Christmas cheer through mutated elves and suicidal Santa. We experienced psychological horror in Brian and Stewie, trapped in a vault with nowhere to escape and nothing to do but confront vulnerability and mortality. We witnessed body horror in episodes featuring kidney transplants that would kill the donor, serial killers targeting teenagers, and graphic violence that pushed boundaries of what animated television could show. We explored twisted relationships in episodes about inappropriate family dynamics and workplace harassment, seeing how power imbalances create suffering. We examined family dysfunction in episodes that revealed the toxicity beneath suburban normalcy, showing how families can psychologically destroy their members through accumulated cruelty. We ventured into parody and homage with episodes that recreated famous horror stories while adding Family Guy's perspective. We grappled with existential questions about identity and meaning through alternate reality episodes that suggested we might be replaceable and our choices might not matter. And we concluded with absurd horror that defied easy categorization, nightmares too strange to exist anywhere but in animation. Throughout this journey, several themes emerged consistently. First, the show's willingness to violate its own rules and maintain consequences, as seen in And Then There Were Fewer, where deaths remained permanent. When an animated comedy known for its lack of continuity suddenly commits to lasting change, it creates genuine uncertainty and fear. We can't rely on the reset button anymore. Anything could happen, and it might actually matter. Second, the contrast between Family Guy's usual comedic tone and these darker episodes creates cognitive dissonance that amplifies the horror. We're watching familiar characters in familiar settings, but they're experiencing genuine trauma and danger. Peter Griffin, usually a source of comedy through his stupidity, becomes horrifying when his selfishness leads to real consequences. Stewie, whose murderous threats were always jokes, becomes genuinely frightening when he actually kills Lois, even if only in simulation. The show's established tone makes us lower our defenses, making the darkness hit harder when it arrives. Third, many of these episodes explore the fragility of sanity, safety, and certainty. The Vault episode shows how quickly psychological defenses collapse under stress. The Hurricane episode reveals that family harmony depends on keeping everyone distracted from their dysfunction. The Death episodes remind us that mortality awaits regardless of how much we try to ignore it. These episodes force confrontation with uncomfortable truths we usually avoid, using entertainment as a vehicle for delivering genuine horror. Fourth, the show's animated format allows visualization of internal states and conceptual horror that live action struggles to depict. Brian's hallucinogenic nightmare in Seahorse Seashell Party becomes vivid through animation that can show reality breaking down. Stewie's simulation in Lois Kills Stewie allows exploration of dark scenarios within a framing device that acknowledges their artificiality while still making them feel real. The body horror of mutated elves and hybrid puppies becomes visceral through animation that can distort flesh in ways practical effects or CGI might not achieve as effectively. Fifth, these episodes demonstrate evolution in what animated television can attempt. Early seasons had to be more cautious, testing boundaries and seeing what audiences would accept. Later seasons, secure in the show's success and aware that devoted fans would follow them into darker territory, could push further. The progression from relatively tame horror homages to episodes depicting graphic violence, domestic abuse, and psychological breakdown shows how the medium expanded its possibilities. Family Guy helped prove that animation wasn't just for children or light comedy, that it could tackle genuinely disturbing subject matter when properly motivated. The variety of horror explored across these 30 episodes also deserves recognition. Some rely on visceral disgust through body horror and graphic violence. Others create psychological horror through isolation, paranoia, and mental breakdown. Still others generate existential dread through confrontations with mortality, identity questions, and meaninglessness. The show doesn't limit itself to one type of horror, but experiments with the full spectrum, finding different ways to disturb and unsettle its audience. What's particularly interesting about these episodes as sleep content is how they create a paradoxical effect. Horror typically keeps people awake, activating fight or flight responses and maintaining alertness. But when horror is detailed enough, when it's presented through calm narration and familiar voices, when it's clearly fictional and safely contained, it can become oddly soothing. The intensity becomes predictable rather than shocking. The darkness washes over you without demanding active engagement. Your brain processes the content without needing to analyze or react, allowing you to drift towards sleep despite or perhaps because of the disturbing subject matter. The sheer comprehensiveness of what we've covered also serves sleep purposes. 30 episodes, each explored in detail with context, plot summary, analysis of why it's scary, behind-the-scenes information, and thematic connections creates a massive quantity of content. You don't need to remember it all. You don't need to stay alert, waiting for what comes next. The content keeps flowing, regardless of your attention level, providing constant input that your sleeping brain can process peripherally. Whether you're fully awake, drowsing, or drifting in and out of consciousness, there's always something happening, always another episode to describe, always more darkness to explore. The episodes also reveal something about Seth MacFarlane and the Family Guy creative team's artistic interests and anxieties. The repeated exploration of death and mortality, the frequent confrontations with family dysfunction, The willingness to depict graphic violence and psychological breakdown all suggest artists working through their own darkness via their art. Family Guy becomes a vehicle for exploring fears and fascinations that might not have outlets elsewhere. The show's comedy provides cover for serious exploration, allowing dark themes while maintaining plausible deniability through humor. As you lie there in the darkness, comfortable and safe, these stories become distant nightmares observed from security. You're not in danger. You're not experiencing the trauma these characters endure. You're simply listening to descriptions of fictional events, safely removed by multiple layers of mediation. That safety allows you to engage with darkness without fear, to experience horror as entertainment rather than threat. And that engagement, that controlled exposure to disturbing content, can be strangely relaxing once you accept that you're in no actual danger. The characters of Family Guy, despite everything they've experienced across these dark episodes, continue existing in their animated universe. Peter will keep being selfish and stupid, causing problems through thoughtlessness. Lois will keep trying to maintain order while nursing her own frustrations and neuroses. Meg will keep serving as the family's punching bag, absorbing abuse that should be directed elsewhere. Chris will keep being simple and kind, unaware of the dysfunction around him. Stewie will keep plotting and scheming, his genius trapped in an infant's body. And Brian will keep pretending to be sophisticated while drowning in self-loathing and depression. They're trapped in cycles of dysfunction that 20-plus seasons haven't broken, and they'll continue those cycles for as long as the show keeps airing. There's something almost comforting in that unchanging nature. No matter how dark the individual episodes get, no matter what horrors these characters experience, they return to baseline. The show's episodic nature means consequences rarely stick. The simulation reveals in episodes like Lois Kills Stewie make explicit what's usually implicit. None of this really matters, because it can all be erased whenever convenient. That lack of permanent consequence should undermine the horror, and on some level it does. But it also creates space for exploring darker territory precisely because there's always an escape hatch, always a way to undo what's been done. As we close, think about what you've heard tonight. 30 episodes exploring the darkest corners of an animated sitcom. Murders and ghosts, abuse and violence, psychological breakdown, and existential dread. Families tearing themselves apart, characters dying and returning, relationships twisted into horror, body horror and medical nightmares, supernatural threats and psychological manipulation. The breadth of darkness contained within this one show, this comedy that airs on network television, is remarkable when you really consider it. Family Guy has spent decades pushing boundaries, testing what audiences will accept, finding new ways to disturb and unsettle while maintaining its comedic identity. The fact that this content exists, that millions of people have watched these episodes and discussed them and debated their merits, says something about our relationship with darkness. We're drawn to horror even while it disturbs us. We seek out content that makes us uncomfortable because that discomfort is interesting. Because exploring darkness safely helps us process our own fears. Because sometimes confronting nightmare in fiction makes reality more bearable. Family Guy's darkest episodes serve that function, allowing viewers to experience genuine horror within the safe container of animation and comedy. So let these images fade now. Let the darkness recede. You've journeyed through 30 episodes of nightmare, experiencing the worst that Quahog has to offer. But you're safe in your bed, comfortable and secure. The horrors exist only in fiction. Confined to television episodes, you can choose to watch or not. Brian and Stewie aren't really trapped in a vault. Lois wasn't really murdered by her son. The mutant elves aren't real. The haunted mansion on the island doesn't exist. It's all animation, all fiction, all safely contained. Close your eyes now if they're not already closed. Feel your breathing slow, deep, and steady. Your body is relaxed, heavy, sinking into the mattress. Your mind is quiet, thoughts drifting like clouds across empty sky. The darkness behind your eyelids is peaceful, not threatening. You've confronted horror tonight and emerged unscathed. You've explored the shadows and found them entertaining rather than terrifying. Now you can rest. The journey is complete. 30 episodes examined, analyzed, contextualized, explained. Hours of content described in detail. Every scene and theme explored. You've heard it all, or what you've heard has been enough. Whether you were fully awake for every word or drifted in and out, catching fragments while missing others, you've experienced this comprehensive dive into Family Guy's darkest episodes. The content will be here if you want to return. These words waiting to guide you through another night of exploration. But for now, sleep. Let the stories dissolve into dreams. Let the characters fade into the static of your unconscious mind. Let the darkness you've experienced transform into the darkness of restful sleep. The good darkness that heals and restores. You're safe. You're comfortable. You're drifting away into dreams, and that's exactly where you should be. Thank you for joining this journey through the scary side of Family Guy. Thank you for listening to these stories, for staying with me through hours of darkness and disturbing content. If this helped you relax, if the detailed exploration of horror somehow guided you towards sleep, then it served its purpose. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. More deep dives into television and film lore designed to help you fall asleep. More comprehensive explorations of fictional universes. More detailed analyses of characters and themes, all delivered in this calm, steady, sleep-friendly format. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, it's just a show. The darkness isn't real. You're safe. Sweet dreams.